Hi everyone. Good to see you on my channel today. Today I will tell you a wonderful story. It is full of love and kindness. I hope you enjoy it and I wish you an enjoyable viewing experience. Thank you.
A smiling young blonde woman with a neat haircut and a snow-white dressing gown, flawless and perfect, as if descended from an advertising poster of medical services, nodded at the monitor in front of the patient's eyes and said, "Here you are, Mummy, you can admire your child on the screen." At first it was difficult to make out anything, solid lines and spots. But looking closely, the young woman guessed in one of them a lump with tiny arms and legs, the fruit of her and her husband's love. A warm wave of tenderness for this unborn baby spilled into her heart. Nancy's voice breaking with excitement, Nancy asked the eternal female question, which the ultrasound doctor hears 20 times a day. "Is it a boy or a girl?" The female technician guided the machine's transducer across the patient's abdomen and regretfully replied, "You can't see yet, but don't worry, you will find out later. The main thing is that you and the baby are fine." In high spirits, the expectant mother left the office. She didn't want to go home. Robert was all at work and traveling. He couldn't even go to the doctor with her today, and she didn't want to communicate with her mother-in-law. Nancy sat down in a waiting chair in the corridor of the clinic and began to look at the photograph, thinking about how their lives would change after the baby was born. Of course, her ultimate dream would be to move somewhere. Even if the accommodation would be small, rented, it's not so important. The main thing is that this space was only for the two of them, that is, soon 3, as long as without mother-in-law. A heavy sigh escaped her chest at the memory of Mrs. Julia. In a year and a half of acquaintance, she had never been able to understand this woman. It would seem that her only son had found his love, a quiet, homely girl without whims and pretensions. Live and be happy, wait for grandchildren. But no. From the first day, the woman declared a real war on her son's chosen one. Maybe, of course, it's all in the hard fate that fell to the share of Mrs. Julia. Yes, all her life alone, without a husband, engaged in entrepreneurship since the 90s. She had Robert for herself. Now she is concentrating on the most profitable of her businesses, owns a huge chain of veterinary clinics and pharmacies. In the city, she is now a well-known, respected person, even plans to run for deputy. It must have been hard to achieve such a position in society. But why was she, Nancy, so disliked at first sight? The girl was at a loss to guess. Could it be a kind of female hazing? Her mother-in-law had suffered in her youth, so her daughter-in-law's life should not seem too easy. The endless reproaches that Nancy came to everything ready hurt the young girl, who came into a wealthy family right after school. Nancy had indeed seen little of life, for she came from a poor family. Her mother worked 2 or 3 jobs all her life and took little interest in her. And when a wealthy fiancé appeared on the horizon, she was happy to give her daughter in marriage and sighed with relief, at least let her live normally. But having got into a new family, Nancy was not going to just sit in place and take advantage of other people's wealth. From the very beginning, she tried to make friends with her mother-in-law. She took all the cleaning in the huge house on herself, trying not to change anything in the established order, went to help in clinics when there was not enough labor. But her daughter-in-law's efforts failed to melt the ice in Mrs. Julia's heart. Just as she had done at first, she looked coldly at the girl with her lips pressed together. The powerful woman was accustomed to control everything and everyone, and at home she did not give the young daughter-in-law a pass. As soon as she went into the kitchen to prepare her husband's dinner, Mrs. Julia was there. And again nagging, again criticism, "Not so cook, wrong pan took the wrong pan, would not feed your mother with such food." Some sound brought the young woman out of her reverie. She suddenly heard a painfully familiar voice very close by. In her excitement, Nancy noticed a familiar figure in the neighboring office and was glad to see that Robert had come, though he had not come since morning, citing urgent business. Probably he wanted to surprise her and hadn't warned her about it. But that was all right. She had a present for her lover too. Now she'll show him a picture of their child. Maybe he'll be so happy he'll finally agree to move out of his mother's house. Nancy opened her mouth and was about to call out to her husband, when suddenly a pretty brunette jumped up and hung round his neck. Robert gently embraced her and kissed her directly on the lips, leaving a trail of bright red lipstick. Nancy froze in place, dumbfounded, watching the couple, unable to move or take her eyes off them. "Now we're going to see our baby," said the brunette in a ringing, shrill voice, smiling and looking into the eyes of Nancy's lawful wedded husband. "Do you want a girl or a boy?" The man mumbled something joyfully in his date's ear, and she laughed loudly. Nancy's eyes darkened. So Robert was living with two families. How could that be possible? So when her husband tells her he's going to work, he's lying and actually going to another woman. And now it turns out she's pregnant too. And it looks like it's about the same time frame as Nancy's. It just didn't make sense. But what hurt the most was the fact that he had gone to the doctor's office not with Nancy, his wife, but with this mistress. That thought made Nancy come out of her daze and quickly jump to her feet. "Yes," she said loudly as she approached the happy couple. "I'm wondering the same thing. Robert, who do you want more, a boy or a girl?" The world lost its colors and turned into a solid gray fog, thick and suffocating. Nancy was rushing down the pavement, unable to see where she was going, bumping into passers-by every now and then. They looked back in amazement at the running girl with tears in her big eyes. But she didn't care. Her mind was in complete chaos. A bitter lump stuck in her throat and a heavy stone on her heart. Finding a deserted corner in the park, she finally stopped and sat down on a bench. No one could hear her here, and she could let her emotions explode. Nancy covered her face with her hands and sobbed loudly, going over the details of what had happened in her mind. The recent ugly scene at the clinic, when her husband had first looked at her for a long time, then spoke. God, it would have been better if he had kept silent. His words had nearly driven her mad. This was coming from a complete stranger she didn't know. "I'm a man, and I can make up my own mind," he said, suddenly sharp and hard. "I can support another family. I don't argue, everyone lives like that. If you don't like it, nobody's going to keep you." God, but a year ago, he swore to her in eternal love. Said that from now on there were no other women for him. Talked about family values. Condemned other people's cheating and betrayal, but in reality he turned out to be a liar. So what now? Go home and tell everything to my mother-in-law. It is doubtful that she will support her. She's more likely to side with her son. Mrs. Julia had been against their marriage from the very beginning, and had tried all sorts of subtle ways to pressure the lad into giving up the marriage. We've met, and that's enough. Robert married Nancy rather against his mother, wanting to prove his independence. But she was still only angry with her daughter-in-law. Only now the situation was a little different. It was her own grandson, or granddaughter. Will the icy heart of a businesswoman not shake? You can't even go to your mother. You won't get any sympathy from her. All her emotions have long been burned in the furnace of hopeless poverty. All she'll say is, "You're crazy. Don't make it up, go back and bear it." It's easy to say endure under the same roof with a traitor. But where should we put our dignity? Or shouldn't poor people have self-respect? Nancy couldn't live like that for a single day. Sighing convulsively, the young woman wiped her tears and dialed the number of her childhood friend Helen on her mobile phone. She immediately agreed to give Nancy a temporary home, although she openly warned that she would not be able to keep her for long. It was understandable. Helen herself lived with her child in a small room in a communal flat, and had enough problems of her own. When she heard the front door open, Mrs. Julia went into the hallway with her usual haughty expression. Nancy's resentment and annoyance made her think that her mother-in-law must be so distrustful of her, following her around and following her everywhere, because she was afraid that her daughter-in-law might steal something. Grinning bitterly to herself, the daughter-in-law raised her swollen eyes at the woman. She didn't care what she thought or said. The reaction didn't take long and was quite rude and predictable. "Well, what's with the face?" she asked her mother-in-law in an icy, almost indifferent tone. Nancy was silent for a few seconds, wondering whether she should even start this conversation. But then, unexpectedly for herself, she told in one breath about her sudden meeting with Robert at the clinic. Words poured out of her as she described the ugly scene. As she recalled the details, she was unable to hold back the emotion that had accumulated, and the tears rolled down her cheeks again. But Mrs. Julia was in her repertoire, not an ounce of sympathy or even surprise on her face. On the contrary, her face was contorted into a gloating smile, and she gritted her teeth in an arrogant tone. "What did you want, my dear? You got into a rich family from dirt to princes, so to speak. You're living off the land. If it wasn't for Robert, you'd be scrubbing floors like your mother. You have to pay for everything." Such blatant cynicism left Nancy numb. Even the tears suddenly stopped and froze in her eyes, widened in amazement. "Why are you staring at me?" her mother-in-law persisted. "This, my dear, is the truth of life. Everything in this world has its price." "Am I lazy?" The daughter-in-law couldn't stand it, trying to prove her point. "I've been your servant for over a year now. How many times have I helped you in your business? Have I ever once refused you?" The woman only snorted and muttered under her breath for Nancy to hear. Well, there goes her voice at last. I'd been rolling around like a cheese and butter, and here I was, no thanks. It was useless to argue with her. Nancy turned round and headed for the bedroom. No, she couldn't stay in this house another minute. There wasn't much to pack from her own belongings. The idea of taking away anything of more or less value that had been bought during the marriage had been abandoned. She didn't want anything from this family. She had brought all her belongings from her parents' house in a small suitcase. Mrs. Julia was already waiting for her at the exit. With her arms at her sides, and looking at the suitcase with an ironic sneer, she asked in a mocking tone, "So where are you going to go, you hysterical girl? To the bums at the railway station? Where are you going, I ask you?" "Away from this house," quietly replied, and resolutely stepped out of the door. "If you come back in a couple of days, I won't let you on my doorstep, just so you know. You won't get any money or alimony." "I guarantee it," her mother-in-law shouted after her. Apparently, the calmness of her daughter-in-law made her mad and deprived her of her usual self-control. "Make up your mind now. Either you stay or you're going to be miserable." Nancy didn't even look back. As she crossed the threshold and stepped out of the house she hated, she immediately felt a sense of tremendous relief. Yes, she had done the right thing. Out of here, anywhere, as long as it was away from these people. Helen threw her friend a set of bed linen on the sofa and ran off to the night shift, glad that she didn't have to worry about who to leave 4-year-old Johnny with. The single mother had to work day and night. Nancy looked at her with a sad, pensive look. Soon she would have a life like that herself. The inquisitive little boy stayed with Aunt Nancy all evening, playing with him until late in the evening, playing trains and reading stories. It was not until near midnight that the temporary lodger was able to sit down and quietly consider her future. Now was not the time for tears. It is necessary to evaluate the situation soberly. After all, she was now responsible for 2 people. One could not even dream of a good job. A pregnant employee, who would soon go on maternity leave, was hardly needed. It was good that she had some savings from her part-time job. Nancy had worked as a courier for a few months before she got married, and didn't waste her earnings on frivolities. She felt it would come in handy. But the money wouldn't last long, 2 or 3 months at best, and that was if she could find a cheap place to live. There were very few rental ads, and after Nancy had eliminated all the expensive ones, there were almost none left. The only one that caught her attention was a room with a landlady in a private house on the outskirts of Chicago. The price was surprisingly low. In her position, there was no choice. At the given address, there was a modest old house with a small front garden. The yard was unkempt and overgrown. A dog barking could be heard from behind a leaning batten. An old woman of a genteel appearance came to the gate, leaning heavily on a stick and limping. "What do you want, my dear?" she asked, looking at the young woman with an attentive eye. "Hello." The young woman smiled affably. "Did the advert say you were renting a room?" The red dog at the old woman's feet did not want to be quiet, showing his vigilance. The landlady even had to shout at him. "Red, shut up." She hospitably opened the wicket and said, "Come in, my dear. Follow me. I'll show you everything." The room was small but quite nice. The light window was decorated with pretty curtains and small flowers, and on the floor there was a carpet with bright multicolored stripes. The only furniture was a bedside table and a wardrobe. But what else do you need to live? "How much do you want?" the young woman asked, just in case. What if there was a typo in the advert? Even for such a modest accommodation, the price was small. "I don't want anything," replied the old woman. "What do you mean?" "I see you're a nice girl, but I'm an invalid, you see, and there's no one to help me. So I suggest, live for free. You will only help me sometimes in the household, to clean, wash, go to the shop. What do you say?" "What can I say? After my mother-in-law's huge house, there's not much to do here." Nancy found Nancy's grandmother quite pleasant and sane, and Helen's bound to be in a hurry to find a place and move in. The most important thing was that they could save the money for accommodation, and they would need it soon. After all, the birth of a child was ahead of them. Well, it wasn't, but it was worth a try. Only one question came out of my mouth. "When can I move in?" "I could move in right now, honey," replied Granny with a smile. Mrs. Cynthia, as she asked to be called, was not too capricious in the household, requiring only perfect cleanliness in the kitchen. Despite her physical limitations, she loved to cook, and Nancy gladly joined in the process, helping with everything. Almost every day, Mrs. Cynthia baked intricate buns or sugar-crusted biscuits, and on weekends she baked luscious pies and scones. The elderly woman's skillful hands deftly handled the dough, creating new masterpieces. There was much to learn, and Nancy was learning. And in the evenings there was a traditional tea party and long conversations in the cozy light of the lampshade over the table. It's nice not to have a television in the house. People get closer. "I have worked as a cook in a canteen all my life," said an elderly woman. "I miss baking. Lately I have no strength for anything. My hands remember and beg for work. It's good that such a helper as you appeared. I couldn't do it on my own." Nancy learned that the landlady had been a widow for a long time. Her son and his wife had been killed in a car accident about 10 years ago. Mrs. Cynthia had taken her only grandson into her care, but misfortune had followed her around. 2 years ago, her grandson, now a young lad, stepped in for a girl in the park and protected her from a drunken party. Since childhood, he had been involved in sports and easily coped with 3 hooligans. One of the attackers received minor injuries, but afterwards it turned out that he was the son of rich and influential parents. As a result, the rescued girl was intimidated and forced to keep silent, and the grandson was sent to prison. He was given 4 years for exceeding self-defense. This is how a young man, who had barely entered adulthood, paid for his nobility. Mrs. Cynthia suffered a nervous stroke, which left her disabled. Now she waits for the return of her loved one, counting the days, weeks, and months. Nancy got into the story, and in her turn, told the sad story of her short family life. "What a scoundrel!" The old woman shook her head. Then she crossed herself and said, "God sees everything. Everyone will get what they deserve." More than once, Nancy found herself thinking that she liked living with Mrs. Cynthia in that small, unpretentious house. The leisurely, measured pace and warm atmosphere were more precious than the luxury and decoration of her mother-in-law's mansion. In time, Nancy felt as if she were simply living with her own grandmother, whom she did not remember at all. But surely she had been just like that, kind, affectionate, sometimes demanding, but not unkind, understanding, and forgiving. The wait-and-see attitude that Nancy had unwittingly adopted did not bear fruit. The pregnant woman hoped that one day her husband would find her, and together, after a long and difficult conversation, they would come to a peaceful agreement and formalize the separation. But time passed, and from Robert was not a rumor or a spirit. The legal husband and his mother as if completely forgot about her existence, cut out of her life, or hoped that she would come to them on her knees, begging for forgiveness for her ill-considered, spontaneous act. There was no longer any doubt she would have to file for divorce herself. In addition, the mother-in-law promised that the former wife of the son will not receive a penny on the child, and she does not throw words to the wind. So the divorce will be hard. We'll have to fight for the rights of the unborn baby. 1,000 questions swarmed in her head, but there was no one to ask them. Only one thing is clear: she doesn't know the laws and won't be able to cope on her own. The young woman was completely confused, not knowing how to approach this complex case. More and more often before going to bed, she was gripped by a chilling fear. The money would sooner or later run out. And then what to do? This agonizing thought kept her awake for a long time. forcing her to go over and over again the possible ways out of the impasse into which she had driven herself. In order not to panic and go mad, Nancy plunged into pleasant thoughts about the little man who now lived inside her. Closing her eyes, she imagined what he would be like, a mischievous boy or a quiet little darling daughter. "Who are you, little one?" she whispered to him, placing her hands on his belly. "I don't know you yet, but I love you very much." "Well, don't be afraid," she reassured him or herself. "Everything will be all right. Your mum will be fine." Muttering these words to herself, she slowly fell asleep. But morning came, and once again reality hit her head. Help came quite unexpectedly from Mrs. Cynthia. One evening, the elderly woman began her conversation with Nancy, cautiously and ingratiatingly. "I've been telling my friends about you. They live near here and are just like me, lonely old ladies, almost museum pieces, by golly." "Yes, and don't argue." She didn't let the lodger say a word of indignation. "I know all about me. Old people have a philosophical view of life." So she went on, "If you help them as you help me, they are not rich, but they will not be in debt. There will be at least a penny extra for you." The part-time job came in very handy, so the young woman had 2 more charges: a melancholy, panic-stricken Mrs. Mary, who could hardly move even across the room, and a rather still cheerful optimist Mrs. Torrey. Both old ladies had only one misfortune in common. They had long ago been abandoned by their children. It was a painful and sensitive subject, and Nancy's innate sense of tact did not allow her to intrude unceremoniously into other people's personal space. A calm, hard-working young woman, she was liked and trusted by her grandmothers. Soon she knew from them all the details of the vicissitudes of fate of the elderly women. One of them had an older son who had died in his youth, and the younger one had drunk himself to death and had not shown his face for several years. Another had an only daughter who had married a rich man and gone abroad forever. She was ashamed of her past and her proletarian origin, so she simply told everyone that her mother had died, and she had no relatives left in her homeland. After this news, the old woman suffered a stroke from which she never fully recovered. Pitying and sympathizing with both of them, Nancy tried to do more than they asked to brighten up their lonely old age. It was a lot more work, of course, but some money began to trickle in. Feeling under a semblance of solid ground, the pregnant woman decided to allocate a certain amount of money for legal advice on the divorce process. Somewhere had to start. She chose a firm at random, but modestly. Maybe it would be cheaper. Trembling with excitement and thrill, Nancy headed toward the frightening unknown. The balding, short man in the dark gray 3-piece suit and glasses seemed to be an expert and trustworthy at first sight. The whole wall behind his chair was hung with numerous diplomas in wooden frames, which, in the woman's opinion, testified to a high level of professionalism. But the lawyer himself, Mr. Samuel, was not at first very interested in Nancy. Apparently, the appearance of a potential client did not inspire him. What could be taken from such a woman? No branded handbag in her hands, no car keys. But after listening to the problem and studying the woman's documents, Mr. Samuel suddenly became animated. He clung to her with a dead grip, preventing her from getting up and leaving. After the consultation, the man talked nonstop. Occasionally asking leading questions, Nancy was flattered by this attention from the lawyer. She looked at him with admiration and respect, as if he were a deity. How many clever words and professional terms could fit into his head? But the meaning of his florid expressions was so unclear to a simple person that by the end of the conversation the woman was completely confused, having found out for herself only 2 most important things. The first was that she was very fortunate to have such an excellent specialist as Mr. Samuel, and the second was that her case was a very difficult one, but she had to fight and not give up. There is a chance of getting satisfaction in the suit. Without hesitation, the lawyer named a rather impressive sum for the trial and promised to start work as soon as he received an advance. Nancy liked the lawyer's hopeful tone. He seemed to have no trouble handling the case. All that remained was to find the money somewhere to pay him in advance. It was impossible to hide anything from Mrs. Cynthia. The old woman noticed her anxious look at once. Immediately she sat Nancy down opposite her and made her tell her everything. After listening attentively, she got up in silence and went to her room. In about 5 minutes she appeared with a small package in her hands and placed a wad of notes in front of the lodger. "This is for your lawyer. I'm collecting for my grandson, but he still has a little less than 2 years left before the end of his sentence. When you get the money back from your scoundrel husband, you'll give it to him." A nervous shiver ran through Nancy's body, but a feeling of gratitude caught in her throat and her eyes filled with tears. She rushed to hug the old woman. "Thank you so much. I'll give you every penny." She just waved it away. "You will, of course. I believe you." Mr. Samuel was obviously happy about the client's return visit, counted the notes, and immediately printed out the contract so that the new client would understand that everything was official and without deceit. When she left the law office, Nancy finally got rid of the long tension and breathed freely. The formatted document with stamps and phrases in dry business language inspired confidence and optimism. Now the case would move forward, and although the lawyer had warned that there could be no 100% guarantee in her case, for some reason there was full confidence in her soul that everything would be all right. There was no need to worry now. Days and then weeks of waiting dragged on. The lawyer warned that successful work requires a lot of time. True, especially bored and idle women did not have to. Word of mouth is the best advertisement. Now Nancy traveled to other old people. They all had different characters, different fates, but all had one thing in common: bitter loneliness and helpless old age. Even the whims of some of her charges could not cool the zeal of the young woman. She had long been accustomed to such behavior, knew how to find an approach, smooth the situation, diffuse the situation. After all, if you look at the essence of the problem, the elderly catastrophically lack attention and communication. Nancy was always ready to support the conversation, to listen, to sympathize. The lawyer faithfully called from time to time and assured that everything goes according to plan. He prepares, digs in, and earns his fee honestly. For the good of the case asked to be patient, but time went by, and the date of the meeting was not appointed. New notes appeared in the conversation. Now he lamented that his client had decided to divorce before the baby was born, and expressed some doubts that they would be able to prove paternity if the husband refused DNA testing. Nancy was not versed in the intricacies of the law. If he thought it was a problem, then it was. Who was she to question and argue with an intelligent and educated man? But some incomprehensible uneasiness settled again in the back of her mind. Nancy shared her anxiety with her hostess, who shrugged her shoulders uncertainly. "I don't know, dear, as it should be. He's a lawyer to know the law. It was us when we had our grandson's trial. That just got unlucky. There was a dishonest lawyer, took money from both us and the parents of the major, and you can see the result." The conversation was interrupted by a sudden knock at the door. Mrs. Cynthia and Nancy looked at each other fearfully, thinking of the same thing. Who had been able to get past the alert and loudly barking Carrot Top? Why hadn't they heard the dog barking? Nancy jumped up and, with hands shaking with excitement, hurried to open the lock. On the threshold stood a lanky fellow in a dark-colored robe. At the sight of the young woman he froze. A look of surprise flashed in his gray eyes. "Hello," he said, puzzled. "I'm looking for Mrs. Cynthia." Andrew came from behind the lodger, and in the next instant the landlady jumped up as fast as she could. As she went out to see her guest, the young man brightened up when he saw the old lady and rushed to her with open arms. "Grandma dear, it's me back. I missed you so much." Nancy, who was watching the scene, couldn't help smiling. She guessed that it was Mrs. Cynthia's grandson, whom she had loved and waited for. From the excess of emotion, the old woman could not keep on her feet. She was laughing and sobbing. Nancy and Andrew had to put her back in her chair. "Did they let you go early?" The old woman splashed her hands, still in disbelief at her own happiness. "Why didn't you warn me?" "I wanted to make a surprise," the guy replied and looked down guiltily. Apparently, this idea did not seem so good to him now. "At my age, surprises can end badly," Mrs. Cynthia joked, confirming his hunch. "You're strong, Grandma," Andrew said, smiling, and clasped the old woman again with his huge hands. Forgive me. After they had hugged enough and the passion had subsided, the grandmother introduced her grandson to the lodger. And this is Nancy, Andrew. She lives with me and helps around the house. She made me feel so alive. When it finally came to her, the young woman decided to voice what had been on her mind since Andrew's arrival. "Mrs. Cynthia, I suppose I'd better move out now?" The old woman frowned and said in an indignant tone, "What the hell do you think you're doing? You're not going anywhere. We'll squeeze in a little. It's nothing. We'll be cramped, but no offense." She turned to her grandson and said, "Nancy's almost like family to me, so you'll have to sleep on a cot, Andrew." "Oh, Grandma," the boy laughed merrily. "After prison, I'm ready to sleep on a cot or on the floor, as long as I'm in my own home." It was obvious that prison had not broken the young man's spirit. He remained as kind and responsive as his grandmother had brought him up, only somewhere in the hidden depths of the soul quietly until time lurked resentment at the injustice of the world, where only money rules, at the lawyer, who instead of defending his ward, just took and abandoned him, giving him to the mercy of bought prosecutors. The job search, however, did not go well from the start. They were wary of a guy with a prison record and didn't want to take him anywhere, explaining their refusal by invented formalities. No one wanted to find out what he was in prison for. Andrew was not going to despair. Prison is a kind of school of life. The guy was ready for such an unkind reception and freedom. In the end, he got a job as a chauffeur at one of the motor depots. There was always a turnover there, and they looked through their fingers at the applicants' questionnaires. Almost 2 months passed like that, but her inner restlessness grew into anxiety, and on one of the rare free days she could not sit still and decided to pay a surprise visit to her lawyer. Looking into a person's eyes is easier to talk to than on the phone. The lawyer's office was quiet and deserted. Mr. Samuel stood with his back to the entrance and was so engrossed in talking on the telephone that he did not hear her enter. The visitor heard a few fragments of phrases. "Yes, everything's fine. Everything's going according to plan. About the salon, of course. I promised I'd look after your interests. And don't forget my services." The lawyer was making nice with someone, listening to the speaker from time to time. "No, you don't have to transfer anything to your son. She's not going to get anything anyway. I gave your daughter-in-law good treatment. You're lucky it was me who took the case." The unwilling witness to the conversation became uncomfortable and tried to slip out of the room, unnoticed to wait outside, when suddenly the man's name cut her ear. "We'll discuss the amount when we meet, Mrs. Julia. Good day to you." Nancy stood dumbfounded, digesting the information. What Mrs. Julia had groomed her sister-in-law and she would get nothing? No, that couldn't be. There is no such coincidence. An unpleasant truth suddenly came to the surface and put everything in its proper place. Mr. Samuel, it turns out, was working on 2 fronts and all this time skillfully manipulated the behavior and consciousness of the unfortunate pregnant woman who believed him and dared to oppose the family with a lot of money and a famous family name. You, with trembling and disobedient lips from nervous shock, the woman tried to define the deed of her lawyer, but the inner voice did not allow to voice those quite deserved epithets that crowded in the brain at this moment. The situation simply did not fit into her head. Nancy drew more air into her chest and could only utter, "I don't want to do business with you anymore. You're fired." With these words, she left the office, slamming the door loudly in farewell. As she wandered down the street, she pondered. Everything in her soul was broken. Why does she meet traitors on her way? What was it that attracted them? Maybe she is just a naive simpleton whom everyone is ready to deceive. Or maybe Mrs. Julia is right to some extent, and it is necessary to become as callous and cold as she is, and then those around her will respect and fear her. But Nancy can't do that, so she has to suffer and agonize. Consciousness returned to the cruel reality, and again 1,000 questions swirled in her mind. What now? Time is irretrievably lost. The trial was already a week away. She couldn't afford another lawyer. Mrs. Cynthia's savings are all left with Mr. Samuel, so it's all been for nothing. Her ex-husband and his mother would laugh at her, and Nancy and the baby would have to live in squalor. Is there no justice for the common man in this world? Nancy struggled to her feet and opened the door. Mrs. Cynthia was gone, apparently to chat with her neighbor. Andrew, who had been busily taking apart an old iron and trying to fix it, glanced at the lodger and caught a glimpse of her mood. "Nancy, what's the matter? Your face is gone." Nancy, who had held her ground, collapsed into a chair and wept bitterly. The sight made Andrew's chest tighten. He'd hated women's tears since he was a child. "Oh my God," he was distraught. "What happened? Tell me. I'm going to go crazy. What happened?" After a few minutes, through his sobs, he finally understood everything. In the blink of an eye, all the old grudges and memories of the past, like lava flows from a living volcano, rose to the top, ready to burst out at any moment, burning everything in its path. What a bastard! Andrew clenched his fists with force, jumped up from his seat, and ran around the room in a rage. Another corrupt bastard. He couldn't control his negative emotions. In the brain of the man again and again flashed only one thought. What kind of a scoundrel should be to offend this amazing kind woman? What woman? A sweet, naive girl who would soon become a mother. He paced from corner to corner for a while, muttering something to himself. Then he stopped and looked at Nancy with a burning look of determination. "Tell me, what's the address of his office?" Nancy shrank back at the sudden frightening guess. "Andrew, stop it, don't you dare. I'm begging you." But anger clouded the man's eyes. "No," he shook his head with determination. "I'll go and tell him everything. I'll tear his head off for you. He'll be sorry." As he said these threats aloud, the boy was getting more and more worked up. There was an evil, devilish light in his eyes. Frightened Nancy realized that if she allowed Andrew to come to her former lawyer in such a state, he was bound to make a mess of things, trying to do justice in his own way. No, he must not let him go, or he would ruin his life. The woman approached the boy, touched his face lightly with her palms, and said, looking directly into his eyes, clearly and calmly, "Thank you, Andrew." He was a little confused by this unexpected reaction, and the degree of internal heat was instantly lowered. "For what, Nancy?" he asked in a trembling voice and gently pressed her palm to his cheeks. She smiled and replied, "For being in a fairy tale. I am a real princess now, and I have a noble and faithful knight." Andrew grinned sadly and, with a sigh, gently took the woman into a warm embrace. Something warm touched Nancy's cheek affectionately. She opened her eyes and slid her gaze around the room. The morning sunlight persistently broke through the gap between the curtains and fell in golden streaks across the tiny wooden floor, directly onto her pillow. Next to her in the armchair, with his head tilted to the side, Andrew was dozing. All night they chatted arm in arm about everything and nothing. Each told what was in his heart, and this sincerity brought their suffering souls together. When he heard the bed creak, the boy opened his eyes and awoke, pushing sleep away. What's the matter, Nancy?" he asked fearfully, jumping to his feet. "Good morning." Nancy smiled and added affectionately, "It's all right, Andrew. Everything will be all right now." It was unusually light in her heart. Nancy was surprised at herself. Yesterday she had been the unhappiest person in the world, and today it didn't seem so tragic. Perhaps it was because another person shared her sorrows. She, in turn, took on some of his sadness. It seems that the problems have not gone away, but they have become smaller and more insignificant. It is always easier to face troubles and troubles together. Nancy left the house and headed for the bus stop. Today she promised to check on the 2 wards who lived in the farthest houses. It was a blessing that there was a direct shuttle bus from here with no transfers. Every day the fulfillment of the duty she had undertaken was becoming more and more difficult. On the way, looking out the window at the passing residential buildings and gardens gilded in early autumn, she caught herself smiling all the time. The relaxed, benign state of mind lifted the corners of her lips, and the world around her seemed even more beautiful. It would seem that there was nothing to be happy about, only problems everywhere you look. But when you feel real support, when you know that there is a person who is always ready to give a shoulder and come to the rescue, the unknown future is no longer so frightening. In fact, it is a sin to complain about fate. Well, and she loses the trial. Well, let her. So it was decided up there, so be it. But now she is sure that fate will not let her lose. She is favorable and constantly sends her help and new opportunities. First met a kind, sympathetic Mrs. Cynthia at a time when Nancy was in total despair. Now she has a part-time job that will keep her from starving to death. Now there's a wonderful, loyal friend, and maybe more. Who knows? No, that thought had better be discarded at once, and it was not worth entertaining vain hopes. In any case, Nancy is sincerely grateful to all who help her. The extraordinary calmness of the expectant mother was immediately noted by her elderly charges. "Nancy, you are so mysterious today, you will probably leave us soon. It's time to think about yourself and the baby." Nancy just shook her head cheerfully. "I'm not going to leave you yet. I'll help as much as I can." On her way home, Nancy saw a strange, expensive foreign car at the gate. Her heart gave an anxious twinge. What unexpected guest had come to their humble home? What if it was the mother-in-law came to mock her daughter-in-law? She would spare neither time nor effort for such a pleasant event. God, what a shame it would be if her hunch proved true and Mrs. Julia made a spectacle of herself in someone else's house. Nancy quickened her stride, but her rounded belly prevented her from walking too fast. Holding her breath, expecting the worst, she entered the house and looked round. But it was completely idyllic. Andrew was in a cheerful mood, tending to the cooker. Mrs. Cynthia was sitting at the head of the table with a pleased expression on her face, pouring tea for her guest. He was an old man with a gray streak in his hair, and his respectable appearance was unmistakable. It was he who had arrived in the very car of an unknown, prestigious brand. The stranger turned to the stranger and smiled good-naturedly. "Hello, and you must be Nancy," he said in a pleasant, deep baritone. "Yes, yes," the old woman confirmed cheerfully, not letting her mouth open. "This is our lodger, Nancy, our helper, our guardian angel for the infirm old people." And gesticulating vigorously, invited them to the table. "This is Mr. Peter," Mrs. Cynthia explained to the bewildered woman, who timidly sat down beside her. A few minutes later, a surprising, unexpected circumstance came to Nancy's attention. The unknown guest was the father of the very girl whom Andrew had interceded for 2 years before, and had so cruelly paid for. "Here." The man excused himself. "I've been abroad for almost 3 years. I didn't realize my daughter was in such trouble. Her mother and I no longer live together, and for some reason she did not consider it necessary to notify me of what had happened, and she persuaded her daughter that it was nothing to worry her father." Mr. Peter frowned. "Yes, if I'd known then, I'd have had a different conversation with those bastards. I'd have had everyone I knew on my feet, and I'd have got justice." The man sighed heavily. "But unfortunately, you can't turn back the clock." He turned to Andrew. "I'd like to thank you in some way. Maybe some money or help. Go ahead, don't be shy. You saved my daughter and I'd do anything for her." The young man froze in confusion on the spot and shrugged his shoulders. "Well, how can you take money for a noble deed that came from the heart?" But then he suddenly brightened up and exclaimed, "Yes, I have a great favor to ask of you. Help Nancy." "Oh, come on, Andrew," she jumped up, trying to object. The boy gently took her fragile hand in his hands, as if afraid to hurt her, and looked into her eyes with a long, piercing gaze of sparkling gray eyes. "Don't argue, please. The most important thing for me right now is that you are doing well." Holding her breath, the woman looked at her knight. Her heart became like a small bird in the man's large and strong palms. Mr. Peter grew dark as he heard the story of the misery of the unfortunate pregnant woman, the angry, greedy mother-in-law, the lawsuit that had been almost botched by a corrupt lawyer. The new acquaintance, being a man of business, without further ado took a mobile phone out of his pocket and dialed a number. "Mr. Michael, darling, it's good to hear from you." He spoke into the receiver. "Yes, I'm back already." "I will. I'll drop by one of these days. Michael, it's a big favor. I need to help a good person, a mummy-to-be. When? Is there a window tomorrow at 11? Got it. Thank you. See you then." He put the phone away and looked at the embarrassed young woman, who was not used to being the center of attention. "Nancy," he said, "the best lawyer in town is expecting you at his office tomorrow." All expenses will be borne by me. Write down the address. Compared with the new lawyer's office, Mr. Samuel's office now seemed shabby and unimpressive. Nancy cringed as she looked round the luxurious room with its panoramic windows and expensive furniture. Sitting on the edge of the huge leather sofa in the reception area, she felt uncomfortable and feared she would be thrown out at any moment. Her outfit was too out of keeping with such a lavish setting. But Mr. Michael greeted her kindly and cordially, listening carefully to the woman's confused story. He did not go into long speeches with legal terms, as Mr. Samuel had done, but made a brief remark. There's not much time to go into the case in detail, of course, but from what I have heard, I can say for certain that the truth is on your side. I will do everything possible and impossible for you to get the maximum satisfaction on the claim. I don't really want anything from him. At least let him pay alimony, assuming he agrees to a DNA test. Mr. Michael only grinned at this remark and remarked caustically, "Who told you he'd be asked?" Nancy blushed thickly, but the lawyer continued talking. The man interrupted her in a stern voice without even letting her finish her sentence. "This man will still be dealt with by the Bar Association and the Bar Association. He has no place among us. He is a disgrace to the profession. As for your husband's responsibility, I can say one thing. Such people should be punished, and punished severely. I won't be me if I don't beat the hell out of him." He smiled and said goodbye. "Don't worry, Nancy. Think only of the baby now. I'll take care of the rest. Everything will be all right." And a big hello to Mr. Peter. The trial was long and arduous. The ex-mother-in-law and her son fought desperately, using the most vile methods of defense and attack. They shamelessly poured dirt on the former daughter-in-law and wife so that she would not get a penny of their huge fortune. But thanks to a new lawyer, justice was served. Nancy got half of her ex-husband's estate. It turned out to be a lot, trying to avoid taxes in the last year. Mrs. Julia a lot of things reissued to her son. But most importantly, Mr. Michael, using his fame and authority, did everything to publicize the case. The whole town was now aware of this high-profile trial. Everyone learned what kind of person turned out to be a famous businesswoman, who always wore a mask of humanity and kindness, but in fact turned out to be a soulless person. The good reputation of a well-known person in the city was irretrievably lost. Most of her employees quit and moved to competitors, and customers no longer wanted to use the services of a greedy and cruel mistress. Everyone came to the same conclusion. If she treats people like that, what can we say about animals? Andrew gently pressed the accelerator pedal. The minibus approached and slowly stopped at the fountain. A young man jumped out of the driver's seat and helped an elderly couple out of the cabin. "Well, here we are," he said, and pointed to the well-maintained buildings of the old manor, drowning in greenery. "Don't worry, you'll like it here." The place was indeed quite picturesque and quiet. They seemed to be in a completely different world from the city with its stuffy, dusty streets and the constant bustle from which they had just arrived. There was an extraordinary peace and tranquility here. From the flower beds came the delicate fragrance of roses. From the garden came the cheerful chirping of birds. On the benches, elderly people settled down according to their interests. There were chess players, here grandmothers knitting. "Oh, my dear," whispered an old woman cautiously, looking around. "I still can't understand why you need pensioners. Black realtors took away our small flat and put us in some barn." These unpleasant memories made her eyes glisten with tears, and her voice trembled. "We were practically homeless in our old age." Andrew touched her shoulder sympathetically and once again patiently explained. "Mrs. Grace, I've told you before, this boarding house is funded by a well-known charity. We don't have to pay anything. Our task is not to make money on the elderly, but to help them." The woman shook her head, took a handkerchief out of her pocket and wiped away a tear. "God bless you and your foundation. What a noble cause you have started. Here is the director of our boarding house." Andrew waved his hand in the direction of the building, where a slim young woman in a light dress was smiling as she approached them. "Hello, Mrs. Grace and Mr. Gregory," she greeted the newcomers in a cheerful voice. "My name is Nancy. I'm in charge of the boarding house, so if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. Come on, I'll show you around. She led the elderly to the front steps, giving her husband a loving, gentle smile. It had been a long time since they had met, then become friends, until they realized that a different, stronger, and more beautiful feeling had come between them. For several years now, she and Andrew had been engaged in this difficult, but so important and necessary business. It was Mr. Peter who suggested opening such a boarding house, seeing the love and respect with which Nancy treated the elderly. She agreed on one condition: it would be a non-profit project. She wants to help those who really need help. Little Sam, their son, will go to school next year, and Nancy and Andrew are seriously thinking about adding to the family. After all, there is still complete harmony in their home. Fate rewarded everyone by merit. Someone gave love, family, favorite job, and someone, on the contrary. After that very high-profile trial over the family, the former mother-in-law hastily sold all the property and business on the cheap and left town. There was nothing for her to do here. Her credibility had been completely undermined. All that was left was universal contempt and condemnation. Her son Robert never found marital happiness with his mistress. Despite the fact that they had a child, constant quarrels and scandals pushed him to alcohol abuse. Now he is completely drunk and lives in complete loneliness. Life is fair, and sooner or later everyone has to pay for everything. Yes, it's long past time to admit to yourself that family life has failed. It's a real disaster. Catherine used to try to build illusions, make up some excuses. But it's long past time to come to terms with the harsh reality. This deception only makes me sick. After all, the higher you fly up, the more painful it is to fall. And these expectations. How she dreamed in her youth of meeting a worthy man. They will love each other, get married, and live happily ever after. She didn't think about the future. Who does at a young age? After all, we are so taught by cartoons from early childhood, laying a solid foundation in the head, a wedding followed by a happy ending. The expectation, of course, is that there will be no problems further on in life. After all, everything has already been overcome, all the hardships left far behind in the lonely and unhappy past. It would be nice if children were immediately prepared for the true state of affairs. That once a marriage is registered, everything is just beginning. There's a whole life ahead of them, and a whole life to be lived. How does a famous writer put it? Weak people overcome life, courageous people master it. Whatever it is, ahead is a huge space for maneuvers, successes, defeats, hardships, and victories. All this should be lived, feel every moment. And also, continued her philosophical reflections, Catherine, it would be necessary to warn in advance that you marry not one man. Together with him you get a whole family. Who talks about that? Only parents who've had experience, who've been there. But who listens to them? I wish I'd known beforehand. But that's a lie too. When Catherine married Leonard, her mother, Mrs. Cassandra, had given her a lot of educational talks, tried to give her daughter information on her fingers. But did it really matter? Butterflies in her stomach, rose-colored glasses, hormones. That's all that mattered. That's all that mattered. Who listens to their parents when they're young, especially when it comes to matters of the heart? Naively, it seems that parents are already old. They don't remember anything and don't know anything. They've never been through anything like that. And anyway, is such love as there is here and now between you known to anyone? Of course, what happened between you two is a first on earth. What can we do? Everyone goes through this period. It's funny now. But back then it was serious. It was a breakup. That's what was important. It seemed that love would overcome everything. Funny, to be honest, Mrs. Cassandra tried to speak frankly. I don't think this Leonard is a good match. He may be a good man, but you and he are opposites. He's so quiet, so unambitious, so kind. I think a child could fool him. And then there's you. Opposites attract, Catherine repeated the cliché naively. It seemed sharp and to the point. Not always delicately tried to dialogue interlocutor, not responding to the daughter's outbursts. And some things still need to converge. dreams, aspirations. They should be common, you know? You will try to build a common future in marriage. And how, if it's different for each of you? You're so active in your career. You're even taking part-time classes at the institute. Leonard's just going with the flow. That's not going to change. He just needs to find himself, Mum, Catherine persisted. It's all going to happen. You have to realize that men take longer to swing. I have faith in him. All right. Let's say Mrs. Cassandra could hardly believe her daughter's words, but she could see it was useless to argue, especially since she had one more complaint in store for her potential son-in-law. Catherine, have you met your boyfriend's mum? Are you satisfied with this woman? Do you realize you're part of her family? What's the big deal? We are adults, we will build our own family. What do I care about his mother? I won't live with her. And that's the most important thing. The mother couldn't help but grin at her daughter's naivety. Would you really not see how dependent Leonard is on Mrs. Sharon? Or don't want to see? Mrs. Cassandra was genuinely surprised. That mother has the whole family under her thumb. One step to the left, one step to the right, and she's shot. She's a real megalomaniac. I barely made it through an hour of their company that night at the restaurant and hastily retreated, thinking of urgent business. I agreed that she's a difficult person, authoritarian, maybe even autocratic. But that's not my problem, Catherine said. Exactly yours, her mother interrupted and began to lose patience. Okay, I can see that for now you're not going to accept the bitter truth of life. Catherine, you're an adult. I can't forbid you anything, of course. But mark my words, you're going to cry with a mother-in-law like that. Then Catherine, with her youthful infantilism, only snorted contemptuously. Of course, she thought that her mother was mistaken, that everything would be different for her. Unfortunately, that's the way people are. They only learn from their mistakes. It doesn't hurt to see someone else's wounds. And so after almost 10 years of marriage, Catherine continues to bite her elbows. How self-righteous I was. I was a stupid fool. I should have listened to my mum. But now you have to work with what you've got. The woman was tasting all the delights of this marriage, which Mrs. Cassandra had shrewdly foreseen in advance. What does every girl dream of when she marries? To find a support, a reliable shoulder, a man behind whom she will be like behind a stone wall. In Catherine and Leonard's case, it was the opposite. They switched social roles. Maybe that's the norm in Western countries, but certainly not here, where people in the mass of people adhere to traditional values and patriarchal society. Unfortunately, my husband turned out to be weak-willed and uninitiative. Yes, it was noticeable in the beginning, but Catherine hoped that everything will change, that he will grow up, take responsibility, will act actively. But Leonard is a mama's boy who is accustomed from early childhood to listen to his mother and follow orders. He's not used to turning his own head, now having acquired a wife. The unhappy grown-up boy tossed between Catherine and his mother, who to this day refused to let go of the reins of power. Once again reliving her quarrel with her husband, the woman shared with her best friend Vivienne. I just can't take it anymore. It's the same thing. Mum, bloody hell. I'm so sick of it. Can't you turn your own head on? Carefully choosing her words, Vivienne replied, You'll excuse me, but hasn't it been like this all along? Your first comment about Leonard was when you met Mummy's boy. That's true. But I thought it would smooth out over time, that he'd outgrow the childish affection. What's a mummy when you've got a wife? Oh, right. The famous major misconception of women is he'll change. The main misconception of men is she won't change. The interlocutor tried to diffuse the situation. And anyway, what could she say? Vivienne would have broken up with Leonard long ago, but she wouldn't give such advice for anything in her life. No. Let them sort it out themselves. There was no need for any more complaints. Funny and true, Catherine grinned sadly. I realize that I'm already boring you with my constant complaining about my marriage. But lately, I've really been struggling somehow. Things happen. Everyone goes through difficult periods. You think so? My friend interjected hopefully. But we've had these problems for a long time. I think that since you're not doing anything, you're counting on something. If it were intolerable, you'd solve the matter radically." "Yes, there is truth in that," Catherine muttered thoughtfully. "So I'm not ready to decide anything yet. So my boiling point hasn't come yet." Vivian, on the other hand, was angry with herself. She had promised herself not to give advice, not to hint at anything. Interfering in a relationship would be the worst thing in the world. And now she'd fallen into the same trap again. It's extremely difficult to keep your mouth shut. Catherine continued. "Oh, our relationship with my husband was made very difficult by the fact that there was always a third person. Mrs. Sharon, his mum, a real witch in fury, with whom it was impossible to find common ground. And how can one find a compromise when in this woman's view there are only two opinions, hers and the wrong one? She maniacally wanted to follow her son, his life, his decisions. No freedom. Unfortunately, there was no separation. The bond was in place. What's more, her husband's older brother Scott was still constantly interfering in their family. Catherine was physically shuddering even at the sight of him, so disgusted was he with her. Leonard had been accustomed since childhood to the unquestioned authority of his mother and brother. It was impossible to change that paradigm. How much effort had Catherine made, all in vain? How sick of them to meddle and constantly interfere in the private life of spouses. Mum and brother have an opinion on any subject and always incline Leonard to their point of view. The man begins to change, becomes insecure and agrees. But if you say so, yeah, I guess. He no longer cares that he and Catherine have discussed everything and made a joint decision. Things had changed. You could stomp your feet, scream and try to go back to the original plan. But Mrs. Sharon and Scott's authority had never been outweighed. They pressed the sore spots they knew so well, whispering in Leonard's ear. "We're your family, we're family men. You know that family is the most important thing in life. Wives come and go, but we're together forever. How could we want to hurt you? Think about it. We always act in your best interests." And already the husband, as if hypnotized, was repeating what his relatives advised him. How can this not be annoying and infuriating? A classic of the genre. Mother-in-law as from an old bearded anecdote. She's a bitch with an evil older brother to back her up. How did I ever get involved with this family? I've asked myself the same question every time, Catherine, but what's the use? Sprinkle ashes on my head. Of course, conflicts and quarrels often broke out, and here Leonard was held hostage to the situation. He was pulled like a rope. On one side of the barricade were Mrs. Sharon and Scott, on the other, his wife. And it would start. "Stop meddling in our lives. We have a family, we're adults. Leonard's all grown up. When are you going to get over it?" Catherine screamed. "No matter how old he gets, he will always remain my son, and I will always worry and worry about him. I know better what he needs," replied her mother-in-law. "Don't you dare talk to my mother like that," Scott growled through gritted teeth. "Be quiet." And so on and so on. What compromise? What common-sense solutions? At first, in her naivety, Catherine had believed these tales, had thought that her mother and brother were worried about Leonard and wished him well. But the further this strange relationship lasted, the more noticeable it was. Mrs. Sharon and Scott stood on the guard of their interests and benefits, and no one thought of Leonard. But only the husband did not notice it, or did not want to notice it. He repeated over and over like an incantation. "They're my own people, and they only want what's best for me." The husband refused to open his eyes to the truth. Did Leonard sometimes stand up for his wife? Sometimes tried to object. But, unfortunately, the authority of his mother and brother was unshakable. One short glance was enough for a grown man to give up his intentions, and quickly shut up. Yes, it was hard for him. He tossed between his family and his wife with a guilty look. He sincerely believed that all conflicts could somehow be settled, negotiated. "What are you starting again?" Leonard sighed heavily. "Let us sit down and discuss everything peacefully." The kind, sincere man really believed it was possible. He was trying to reconcile everyone like a peacemaker. How naive is that? Leonard didn't even realize that this was war for war's sake and against common sense. He didn't realize his mother and brother didn't like Catherine, just like he wouldn't have liked anyone in her position. Everything was wrong with them. Catherine's opinions were rejected in advance and indiscriminately. The naivety of an adult was staggering in its helplessness. Catherine, unlike her husband, understood everything. She, to the depths of her soul, was offended for him. It was unbearable to watch the reaction of Leonard, who was worried after another rebuke of his mother. What can you do? Catherine resigned herself to it. She had to be more restrained, nodding and smiling. After all, she knew that objections would not change anything. So why provoke her? But it's easy to think in hindsight. In the moment, my mother-in-law was so annoying. I wanted to slap her and throw her out. Go to hell, Mrs. Sharon's never going to be satisfied or prove anything. And it would be defenseless Leonard who would suffer. Catherine calmed her husband and once again made a promise to herself that next time she would surely hold back, find a compromise and adjust. But only in a new quarrel everything was repeated again and again. The mother-in-law violated her daughter-in-law's personal boundaries, tried to hurt her, insult her, humiliate her, pursue her, and inevitably Catherine would snap. She just couldn't take it. Frankly, this vicious circle has long been annoying. No matter how much a woman does not love her spouse, there was a limit to everything. Catherine's nerves simply could not withstand such a race. Yes, she more and more often thought about divorce. Feelings for the spouse still remained, but his family, his damned relatives, and Leonard himself, his temper tipping the scales. Just as Mum had warned, the man was wimpy and weak-willed. On top of that, no initiative or ambition. And this is in contrast to the energy and lust for life itself. Catherine. Husband sat on the couch, and especially not stressed. Worked at a dusty job as an ordinary manager without any chance of success in career advancement. The salary wasn't that great. What's there to hide? Leonard wasn't even self-sufficient on his salary. Catherine provided for the family. Yes, she worked day and night. It was a natural inclination, a desire to succeed, to be successful, independent. But in addition, there were objective needs. Who, if not her, will provide for the family? Denny herself everything. Not interesting. Once again, the family scandal would begin. Leonard, and how do you see my maternity leave? What kids? Are you going to be able to provide for us? Or are we going to live on welfare? Catherine was indignant. You're talking about money again. Her spouse grabbed his head. But how much can we beat around the bush? How long can a grown man sit around and be satisfied with little? All right, let's leave the money out of it. But don't you have any ambition? Aren't you interested in becoming someone yourself? To make any progress at all? Catherine, imagine, no, I'm not interested. I want to live the ordinary life of an average person. Do you understand? Catherine was even taken aback by this admission. It was too much out of her worldview. For her, self-fulfillment in life was the goal. It seemed to be the same for everyone. And now it turns out that her husband, her own man, has completely different attitudes and outlook on life than she does. What about me? The woman asked quietly. Our children that you are always talking about, do you not care about them and their future either? Or let them live an ordinary life too if daddy hasn't managed to earn a better one? If they want to, let them do well on their own. They have someone to take an example from, you, the husband parried in response. But children must be given a start. And with what means? Or do I have to earn again? Save up for a maternity leave, then provide for the whole family. That's a great plan, Leonard. You have too grand an idea of what it should be. I think there's enough already. It's enough for the children to provide a comfortable minimum. Enough. Enough, Catherine cut her husband off sharply. She could not bear to listen to such musings. It was so out of sync with what she was thinking. Even a wonder, and how they managed to live so many years together so different. No matter how many scandals there were between the spouses over money, it did not change anything. Leonard was not going to leave his comfort zone. Everything suited him. But Catherine, as her friend correctly pointed out, apparently has not yet reached the limit to radically put the question. But all this rage and bitterness had to look for an outlet. The women vented their negative emotions and general discontent by complaining to their friends. Both Vivian and Marion already knew. In every girl's sitting, they would inevitably have to listen to Catherine's discontent about her husband and his closest relatives. What to say, the friends all in their personal lives were not the best. so every meeting was like a group support session. Everyone had to talk about their troubles and get some advice, or at least be heard, to get a little dose of support. No, I can't do this anymore. Catherine started a favorite topic. I swear, one more last straw and I'll file for divorce. That's it. I can't, honestly, tired. Both Vivienne and Marion nodded sympathetically in response. That's a difficult situation you're in. Usually couples split up when the love is gone, and there's nothing left but resentment instead of good feelings. You still have some good feelings, but hell, how far can you go on that love? I just admire your patience, Marion admitted honestly. Okay, Leonard's half the battle. Everyone has their faults, as they say, and they can be worked around. But your mother-in-law, I wouldn't go near her. I'd be afraid I'd lose my nerve, and in the heat of a quarrel I'd strangle her. It's not that simple, Catherine grinned bitterly. More often than not, there's Scott looming next to her to take me down with one hand. Bandit face. God-sent relatives. Yeah, Vivienne stretched out. You see him in the dark on the street, and you'll have a heart attack. It's all over your face. And yet, Marion changed the vector of the conversation. You have love. That's a lot. I do, but it's all through agony. Is it worth it? There are some things very cynical, but rational, common sense things to think about in advance. Catherine reasoned tiredly. I want to have a baby, after all, and I'm about to turn 32. You can't wait too long. When will Leonard grow up? And now there is no hope for him. What kind of father is he? He can't take care of himself. On top of that, Vivienne thought, a child will bind you forever to your husband's family. They will be family to your baby and will remain so forever, no matter what happens. Divorce is not divorce, it will not matter. It's scary to even think about. All in all, it was a hopeless situation, and what was there to do? Everything is very unstable and shaky. Divorce and forget it like a terrible dream. But where to keep feelings in these reflections about his future? Catherine was constantly stuck in these thoughts, could not find the right answer, how to act, and postponed decisions for later. This conversation with her friends once again stirred up feelings. But the woman was not ready for a rational solution to the problem. After all, she lived with the man she loved, no matter what. And to be fair, while Leonard did not do anything that would cross out the happy memories and lived a life together, he was just being himself, not changing. A few days later, Catherine flew away on a business trip for a week. Decided that the time away from her husband will help her to concentrate, detach, reflect. But there were so many things to do that she couldn't even breathe. She returned home even more depressed. And there was a surprise. During dinner, Leonard proudly announced, "Oh, by the way, I wanted to tell you the news." Looking at her satisfied husband, Catherine was immediately alarmed. That look on his face didn't bode well. They had been through this before. There was nothing worse than misplaced initiative. So, tensing, the woman asked again, "What news?" "Honey, don't get mad. I took out a loan for Scott and his wife. They bought a new car too. But you know he wrecked his, and he needs to work." Leonard might have said something else. It was just that Catherine had blacked out. She directly felt anger and rage and fury and frenzy clouding her eyes. She interrupted him, clenching her hands into fists, trying to balance on the verge of breaking down. "But your brother is unemployed. How is he going to pay back the loan?" "That's what I'm saying. He'll get a job and he will," Leonard replied. "Leonard, are you crazy?" Catherine couldn't stand it. Her nerves had given way. "You took out a loan in your name for another man for my brother." "Yes," replied the spouse peacefully. "Who in their right mind takes out loans in their own name for other people?" She continued, paying no attention to her husband's attempts at justification. In Catherine's picture of the world, even a sibling was an outsider, especially one like Scott, especially in matters of money. "It's for Scott," Leonard tried to cut in again. It was noticeable how his joy and pride in himself and his deed had already waned. He was no longer smiling, but looking anxiously at his wife, who was getting more and more turned on. "What difference does it make? We'll have to pay it back." The bank doesn't care who spent the money. What matters is who took it. It didn't make sense to her. How could this be allowed to happen? To think of such an absurdity. It's a complete stupidity. Catherine simply could not contain herself. She raged and shouted at her husband, who under the pressure shrank before her eyes. Leonard had already given up trying to justify himself and present the situation in a favorable light. He realized that the idea was a failure and hopeless, though the man still didn't really understand what he was being accused of. He was proud of his manly act, of his decision to help his brother and his family. What could be wrong with that? They are one family, after all. Mutual support and help is very important. Meanwhile, Catherine was beginning to feel dizzy. She realized her utter helplessness and powerlessness. "I just don't understand how you came up with this," his wife finished her tirade tiredly. "It's unimaginable." "But Mom said I should help. After all, money is good in our family." Catherine's breath caught, as if someone had kicked her under the breath. And how had she not realized it was bloody Mrs. Sharon behind it? She couldn't scream anymore. Her ligaments ached treacherously from the strain, and her throat was sore. So Catherine asked again quietly and very ingratiatingly, "Leonard, money is fine in our family because I earn it. I'm the one who works around the clock, you understand. What right do you have to manage the family budget if you have little or no input into it? Those decisions should be mine. I should at least be consulted. You make $3,000 a month. How are you going to pay off your debt with it?" Such stupidity on her husband's part just didn't sit right with her. Worse, Catherine had already begun to calculate in absentia the prospects of getting out of this story and realized that their chances were nil. Leonard had involved not only himself, but his wife as well. "You get all the documents and the loan agreement here immediately. I want all the figures and terms." And she hadn't even asked Leonard about the loan amount yet. To be honest, it was just scary. First, she had to exhale a little and calm down. With emotions running so high, the woman was just afraid she wouldn't be able to hold herself together. The documents only made it worse. Catherine went into shock. This fool had taken out a loan of almost $200,000. And who had given him such a loan? Leonard was required to make monthly payments of almost $5,000. And for years on end. The interest rate is monstrous. Who gave you those terms? Catherine couldn't help herself. She was ready to bang her head against the wall. The loan payment is more than your official salary. Scott told me not to worry, that the payments were his concern, Leonard replied softly. He really believed that. This naivety and simple-mindedness of his spouse was just confusing. He hadn't even realized he'd done anything serious. Scott said. His wife couldn't resist a dismissive tone. Catherine tried to frantically think, but everything developed in one direction. There were no loopholes and could not be. She and her spouse were trapped. And if Leonard was to be punished for his stupidity and gullibility, what is it? The woman grinned to herself. I, too, will be punished for my stupidity. We should have divorced a long time ago. It's only a defense reaction. In reality, I wanted to weep. Nothing would help them. Leonard took out the loans in his own name, signed his name, and took the money. What did the bank care what he did with it? I don't care if he gambled it away. The only answer is to pay it back according to the payment schedule. And Catherine's his partner. She's legally married to Leonard. So all of the liabilities will be split in half. There's no way to prove anything to the court. I don't care if Catherine's never even seen the money. It was all excuses and empty talk. And most of all, the woman pissed off that nasty mother-in-law, Mrs. Sharon, was able to get around her finger and humiliate her. The wretch had planned and calculated everything. She chose the time, persuaded the good, naive son, well worked behind his wife's back. Catherine was furious with Leonard, her mother-in-law, Scott, and herself. That she had made such an oversight and allowed herself to be cornered. Needless to say, the woman didn't believe for 1 second that her husband's brother would actually pay back the loan on his own. Why, he'd be paid off. Only Leonard could believe such a thing. His faith in people was discouraging. If it weren't for such dire consequences, it would even be admirable. Catherine had long ago lost her kindness and faith in the best. They were replaced by cynicism, calculation, and pragmatism, which in some is called life experience. It was pointless to keep shouting and getting angry at her husband. Everything had already happened. It was necessary to take herself in hand and act constructively. The first thing Catherine decided to do was to call Scott herself. She was still hoping for a miracle. Maybe Leonard was right. There's always hope for the best after all, even when common sense doesn't believe in such an assumption. "Hello," Scott responded. Catherine tried to clear the air and began to calmly say that Leonard had shared that he had taken out a loan on his brother and wanted to clear up some details. "What?" The man rudely interrupted his sister-in-law. "I don't know what you're talking about." Damn it, how expected, Catherine thought to herself, but didn't give up. "How Leonard took out a loan, gave you the money to buy a car. Are you out of your mind?" Skillfully indignant older brother of the spouse. "What are you all? What loan? So don't even dare drag me into any nonsense. I bought the car, but I didn't take a penny of money from Leonard." Without waiting for a reply, he simply switched off, demonstratively showing that the conversation was over and that he had made his position clear. Was it necessary to say that morally Catherine was preparing for this? The second point of the hopeless plan was to dial the number of her mother-in-law and try to talk to her. I mean, she had dragged her son into this. Maybe she'd stand up for him, talk to her eldest son. Though there was little hope of that, Mrs. Sharon loved the cattle much more. If she loved Leonard at all, to be frank, Catherine doubted it, given her experience with him. Her mother-in-law listened very carefully to her daughter-in-law's speech, and at the conclusion of the message, she stated sternly, "Catherine, I have no idea what this is about. What loan? What are you talking about? Cattle bought a car." "Yes, he did. But I'm the one who gave him the funds, helped him through a difficult situation." "How so, Mrs. Sharon?" Catherine was taken aback. Still, she had expected some other answer from her mother-in-law. Such denial was hard to assume. "Leonard says." "Listen," interrupted her mother-in-law. "But what does it matter what he says? I'm making it clear enough to you how things really were, though I don't have to account for it. I don't know what purpose the son is pursuing. He's probably taking out a loan and lying. He's just lying about his own brother. He won't tell me where he spent the money. Why is this our problem? It's your husband, your family. Sort it out." "It's not even serious." The sister-in-law couldn't stand it and shouted. Emotions ran high, and it was getting harder and harder to keep herself in line. "You gave Scott money for a car. Where did you get so much? 200,000. Are you kidding me?" "I've been saving up." "Yeah, I've been denying myself a lot of things." "So what?" Mrs. Sharon got angry. "That's none of your business. You're not the taxman, sweetheart," cut off her mother-in-law, ending the conversation. Catherine was terribly mortified. It was all predictable, expected, but such a stab in the back from her own people. How will Leonard stand it? Cattle and Mum are everything to him. "You heard everything," the woman exhaled, turning to her husband. "And what do you say? But you believe me, don't you?" Tears of resentment came to Leonard's eyes. "You believe I took out a loan for Scott, gave every penny of the money to him. You don't even have to doubt it. I believe that completely. But what's next? What's the next step? Your mum and brother made a laughingstock out of us, accused us of lying and screwed us out of a huge sum of money. What do we do about it?" Hey. The husband was silent. Actually, what could he say? He was so shocked and dumbfounded. This peaceful, loving, and naive man could not have imagined that everything would turn out so miserably. His world crumbled in an instant. Catherine was devastated herself. Upset, but she wasn't going to push it. Of course she was angry with her husband. But what was the use of shouting? We must at least try to get out of the situation with less loss. But how to do it was a big question. The night passed very restlessly and anxiously. The couple couldn't sleep. They hardly spoke to each other. Each of them was going through what had happened on his own. The wife was afraid to speak to Leonard. She didn't want to snap at him again and slip into accusations. It would only get in the way now, and it wouldn't help anyone. Leonard, on the other hand, is rethinking his whole life. Despite his guilt over what had happened, it was much harder on the man. What could be worse than being betrayed by his own mother? Early in the morning, having scoured all available sites on the internet, Catherine had already chosen a lawyer to whom she was going to consult. Maybe a knowledgeable person will be able to advise something, somehow help. But the terrible expectations of the woman only confirmed in the course of the conversation. Since Leonard withdrew the money and gave it to his brother in cash, it is almost impossible to prove the fact that the money was transferred, word against word. There were no documents, receipts, or even correspondence in the hands of the defrauded couple. Mrs. Sharon and Scott had the foresight to unilaterally delete all correspondence. It turned out that such a function exists in some messengers. Worse, the mother, as it now turns out, will stand up for her eldest son, will cover for him to the last. So what to do in this situation? Catherine was stumped, and her more and more helpless anger was growing. After all, for almost 10 more years she will pay the loan for Scott's car, and all he'd do was enjoy the ride, and not give a damn. How is that fair? It's absurd. Lawyer Mr. William, listening to the irritation and indignation of the client, only spread his hands. Unfortunately, I don't want to get your hopes up and profit from you in litigation. The court decision will not be in your favor. Take it as a fee for experience. Maybe it will be easier then, a payment to let horrible, disgusting people out of your life forever. The man really meant to be encouraging, supportive, but it still came out rather dubiously. Is there really nothing that can be done? Unless we force the borrowers to give the money voluntarily, to confess the very fait accompli of the loan at the worst, replied Mr. Williams sympathetically. It's hopeless. Catherine waved her hand. There was nothing more the lawyer could do to help his client. It seemed mean and unacceptable to make false promises to her for his own enrichment. The man would be glad to help, but with what? Leonard had done something stupid. Motivation didn't matter in this case. It was necessary to assess the situation exactly as it was, and not try to hope for a miracle. Catherine left the law office completely crushed. I didn't want to go home in a sulk. They will have to talk to her husband, tell him about the consultation. This will lead to another scandal and quarrel. There was no moral strength for that. On the contrary, the woman now needed support and a kind word. It was decided to go to her mother. She would at least listen to her, maybe advise her something. And what if? Catherine was ready to cling to any miracle and any, even the most ghostly hope. Of course, there were fears that her mother would be shocked, would shout and swear at her son-in-law. That was something she didn't want to happen. Still, Catherine wanted to protect her husband. He had acted foolishly, but honestly, relying on love and all the good that was in him. He had been betrayed, trampled and humiliated, insulted in the best feelings. That's where the basic root of evil lies. After all, Leonard didn't take out the loan for his whims, not for a stranger. He believed in what he was doing. But surprisingly, Mrs. Cassandra ignored her daughters and Leonard's role in this epic. On the contrary, as an aggrieved woman, she sympathized with them intensely, swearing as much as she could at Mrs. Sharon and Scott. Honestly, I just can't imagine how anyone can be such moral freaks. It's awfully bad when con artists scam strangers. But here, this is a son, a sibling. How could you do this to a human being? Is your mother-in-law a witch like the world has never seen? Catherine smiled, trying to tone down the conversation a bit. I knew that before it happened. You tell me. Do you have any advice? See some way out, assessing with sober outside eyes. What can I do? Mrs. Cassandra was genuinely surprised. I'm not a lawyer, not a solicitor, not an expert on such matters. Nor do I have any acquaintances in this field. How can I advise you? So lawyers haven't helped me either. I had to share the outcome of the legal consultation with my mother on top of everything else, to relay Mr. Williams' words. So there is a way out after all, Mrs. Cassandra pondered, asking them to return the money. Catherine grinned back. She was simply amazed at her mom's naivety. No better than her husband. Yeah, now everyone suddenly remembers their conscience and decides to take a head start. Why ask? To force. That's a more accurate word. But how? I don't know that. but every man can be pressed, especially if you know where to hit. Are you talking about violence now? Catherine was horrified. No moral beating. Although violence can be left as a backup and last resort, I wouldn't rule it out. God, Scott so definitely deserves that approach, at least for educational purposes. Catherine looked embarrassed somehow. Oh, come on, no one here is a saint. And anyway, I think you're starting to forget that we're talking about yours, about something that was stolen from you. There was common sense in what Mum said, though the idea of physical action still frightened Catherine. Those were not her methods, but there was no need to dismiss anything right now. One had to stock up on options to solve the problem. When a tired Catherine finally arrived home, Leonard found her in the doorway. The man was clearly out of breath. I couldn't stand it and called my brother and Mum again. I wanted to ask their conscience. How could it be? Leonard couldn't calm down, couldn't find a place to be. And what? His wife asked rather out of politeness. She had already seen the look on Leonard's face, and so she wasn't counting on good news. Called Scott and just demanded my money back. Don't think I didn't bother to tell him you were the one who was unhappy, that you were the one demanding. And you know what he said. He answered so bluntly that he didn't take anything from me. Just like that. So you heard it yesterday. That's what he told me. Why are you surprised? I didn't believe then that he could say it straight out like that. After all, it's not true. Lying to your face. How can one do that? It can. And apparently, from the looks of it, it's easy and simple to do. And I also called my mum, the spouse reported with great sadness in his voice. He was completely shattered. She didn't even shout at me, claimed that I had taken a loan spent unknown. And now, to get out of it, started blaming my brother and shame on me. Catherine would have been glad to say something somehow to support her husband, on whom there was no face. But what was there to say? Insult the in-laws and complain? Fortunately, Leonard wasn't paying attention to anything. He was focused on what he was experiencing at the moment. Geez, how come? Mum talked me into it for so long, got so excited when I handed the money to Scott from hand to hand. They thanked me with glee. They assured me they'd pay for it themselves. Though Leonard was ready to cry with resentment and indignation, his wife still couldn't contain herself. Indeed, here they are, your own people, the ones you always sidelined me because of. After all, they are true family by blood. And how is it now? How does it feel? Well, they've repaid your love and loyalty in a worthy coin. Even though it was horrible and wrong, Catherine was tired of holding it in. After all, she was a living person and was entitled to emotions and opinions too. I didn't realize. The man began to babble. I had no idea. They swore they would help give back, said words of gratitude, how I helped. That's the way it always is. People forget good things quickly. As the lawyer told me, we paid for the experience. Expensive, of course, Catherine said. What are we going to do now? It's a disaster. Leonard only now seemed to finally come to terms with the situation and realize the magnitude of it. It's such a huge amount of money. It is, and we're going to have to pay it, just like the lawyer told me. There's no other way out. We have no evidence on our hands. Of course, Mrs. Sharon and Scott will say they've never seen any money, and that will be the end of it. Catherine was being a bit facetious and not telling the whole truth. She did not yet know how much she could trust her husband. She didn't want to reveal all the cards. Leonard needed to think about it some more. Maybe she'd find a way out on her own. For now, pressing her husband's mother and his brother was not something she wanted to talk about. Hell knew how her husband would react. You could expect anything from him. The second night, which turned the world of the couple, was as disgusting as the previous one. Sleep did not go well, had nightmares. Thoughts were swirling in my head, and my soul was heavy. I had to get into such a mess. What a stupidity. In the morning, Catherine crawled into the kitchen completely shattered. It was a good thing that thanks to her weekend job, she had some time off to use. Otherwise, it would have been another disaster. How to work like this? It's completely incomprehensible. The woman needed some time to accept the situation. To be honest, she was already trying to convince herself that she would have to pay. There was no getting away from it anyway. Leonard sat at his desk, completely engrossed in his laptop. Even flinched at the flick of the kettle switch. "Good morning. Sorry, got caught up reading," he said. "What's got you engrossed?" his wife inquired. It was too atypical a situation. Leonard usually sat in front of the television or with a book. Technology was not his thing. "Look, I think I've found a way out." "What do you mean?" Catherine asked. "What's wrong with you? Do we have other problems?" "Of course, how to get the loan money back." "Naturally, we need to get Scott to give it back to us." She had heard about the same thing before and even pondered it. But she decided not to give any sign of it, but to be indignant again, because her whole being resisted the idea. "I only wonder how you imagine it. I mean, he flatly refuses. He says he bought the car himself, that his mother helped him." "I think there's a chance," Leonard replied as evasively as possible. "Explain it, please. You were sitting here drinking last night, and you yourself admitted the fiasco. You yourself were horrified at how cynical and thoughtful traders your mother and brother turned out to be. So what now? How do you plan to outplay them?" Her spouse, clearly unwilling to go into detail, answered even more vaguely. "Let's put it this way. I have some leverage with Scott. I'd hate to do it, but he's the only one who hasn't left me any options." What do you know? What's on your mind?" The woman was starting to get more than a little nervous. Of course she wanted to know the details of what he was up to. His past rash behavior was enough, but except that no matter how hard Catherine tried to get to the truth, to find out the details, Leonard stood his ground. "I don't want to talk about it. It's my business. I'll settle the matter, I promise." "I'm scared." "Leonard, stop it. And everything will be fine. You have my word." Only could such assurances reassure anyone. Her heart was out of place. Catherine knew perfectly well that her husband wasn't the kind of person who could make up his mind about anything. She should have trusted him, given him the reins and handed over the responsibility. That would be fine. It was exactly what the woman had wanted for a long time. But she knew Leonard like the back of her hand. What good would that do? Anyway, she didn't really expect this hopeless endeavor to succeed. Although it should be recognized that her husband, for the first time in his life, had somehow transformed, insisted on what he wanted, was confident and firm. What if? But I did not want to take his word for it. Catherine decided to wait for the results. Leonard went somewhere, refusing to give details. Already closing the door behind him, on the threshold, he turned round to embrace his wife and kiss. "You'll see, my love. I'll solve everything. Himself brewed this mess, myself, and I'll clean up the mess." Catherine understood that her husband was waiting for feedback from her, words of trust and support, but only to say nothing could not. She had mixed feelings. She did not want to deceive. Nevertheless, for her husband, Catherine was very worried, anxiously rushed around the flat and thought of what plan he could have. Nothing came into her head, and the tension was growing. After all, she knew about Scott's criminal record, which didn't add to the optimism. After only a few hours, her nerves were already strained to the breaking point. What was he thinking there? How much had Leonard been able to calculate all the risks, think everything through? Counterbalancing that was a new, incredible feeling. It was so unaccustomed to Leonard taking responsibility and letting him fix his own mistakes. He hadn't done that before. Unbelievable. It was nearing nightfall, and she hadn't heard from her husband. Catherine texted endlessly. She was afraid to call or write regular messages. What if he's out there, where it's better not to draw attention to himself? Catherine hoped that her spouse would finally look at the screen of the phone and answer at least something. On the clock it was 3, when the nerves were loosened to such an extent that the woman could not stand it and dialed the number. To no avail. The soulless robot reported that the called subscriber was temporarily unavailable. Anxiety and panic from such news only increased even more. What kind of sleep would there be in such a situation? Even though the previous 2 nights had been almost sleepless, there was no sleep in either eye. Her heart was pounding at a frantic pace, and her hands were shaking feverishly. The wife felt that something bad had happened. The subconscious mind was deliberately throwing up variants of events, where each scenario was much worse than the previous one. Where to run? Who can help? Leonard was clearly in trouble, and she's sitting there just staring helplessly at the phone screen. It was almost 0700 hours. It was beginning to dawn outside the window when the phone rang, an unfamiliar number. But Catherine answered on the first ring tone. Hello, Catherine. I'm listening. This is Senior Lieutenant Love calling about your husband, Leonard. Could you please come to Hospital 6? What happened to Leonard? The woman almost shouted. How is he? There's not much I can report at the moment, Catherine. The policeman replied as calmly and discreetly as possible. Your husband is badly beaten and has been taken by ambulance to the hospital. There is an operation in progress now. I think I will know more by the time you arrive. Okay, I'll be there soon. Please try to take care of yourself. Move around as carefully as possible. It's best not to drive in this condition, the senior lieutenant instructed sympathetically. I'm sure you don't want any unnecessary problems right now. Hastily thanking the officer of the law, the woman disconnected. Packing was a minute affair. Catherine hadn't changed her clothes. Yesterday she had sat in suspense. Heeding the policeman's advice, she hailed a taxi. Unable to stay at home, she went outside to wait for the car. Getting to the hospital, the first thing Catherine rushed to the information window. Talking to the policeman and finding out what had happened could wait. It was necessary to find out what condition he was in. What was he in danger of being hurt? The nice nurse assured the wife. Your spouse is in intensive care. This is normal practice after surgery. Don't worry. We can't see him yet, but as soon as he's moved to his room, we'll let you know. Okay, thank you, Catherine murmured. Is anything clear about the injuries? How's his general condition? Condition is moderate to stable. At least that's that. Catherine calmed down a little, though she naturally realized that anything could have been lurking behind that dry statement of fact. Exhaling a little, the woman on cotton legs slowly began to move towards the bench. The strength left the unfortunate woman. This was how things were changing. So many events were happening every day. Shock after shock after shock. Her nervous system was literally on edge. The policeman approached on his own. He must have spotted a woman with a frightened and pale face. Hello, Catherine. She nodded. There was no strength for anything else. What the hell was politeness in a situation like this? I'm the one who called you, he said. Except that instead of telling the victim's wife something, the senior lieutenant was trying to elicit information from her, asking questions about where Leonard had gone. Did he have any conflicts with anyone? Maybe his behavior had changed recently. Catherine decided to keep her secret for now. At one point she was thinking of already saying about the family conflict, to tell that the spouse went to meet with his own brother. But something stopped her. She decided to hold her tongue. There was no telling what was going on. It was better to talk to the husband first, to clarify the situation. To interfere now, when a man lay unconscious, might be foolish and rash. So the wife waved her hand, saying he'd gone and disappeared. She has no further information, no further details. Where did Leonard go? He didn't report. What do you know? Catherine herself could not resist asking. Where was he found? Who called the ambulance? You have to understand, I'm going crazy with the unknown. Leonard was found unconscious in the street. Help was summoned by a passerby. The senior lieutenant seemed to realize that his wife was hiding something or not telling the truth, and in response he was very restrained and stingy with details. He said only what was not a secret and was known even in the ambulance directory. Catherine wondered even more. Everything was incomprehensible and unclear. She needed to have a word with her husband as soon as possible to find out what had happened. Now to fuss and try to overtake events, it's expensive. There was no hurry. The wife was allowed into the ward only in the morning around 11. All this time, the unfortunate was engaged in self-abuse and trying to guess what really happened. Of course, it did not add stability to the nervous system. At first, the patient was examined several times by the doctor there was around. Then he had a long chat with the police, and then it was the wife's turn. It was a pity. but there was nothing to be done. When she entered the room, the woman was horrified and involuntarily sobbed. She covered her mouth with her palms. Her husband looked so monstrous. Leonard could be recognized only by his eyes. Instead of his face, it was almost a mess of bruises and bruises. His arm was broken in 2 places. It had to be operated on. Blunt force trauma to the abdomen. He was beaten with his feet. There was no doubt in Catherine's mind that Scott had done the artwork. Leonard, my God, what a nightmare. The horror. She couldn't hold back the tears. Catherine jumped up to her husband. She did not know where to touch him. It seemed that instead of a body, he had one big wound. She didn't want to cause him any more pain and suffering. What happened? Who did this to you? I didn't tell the cops anything. Thank God, her husband exhaled. I knew you'd guess. Acted at my own risk. Gave my statement and hoped you'd realize it wasn't worth telling me anything yet. Explain, please, or I'm about to go completely insane. All I've done for the last half of the last 24 hours is try to solve riddles. I can't take it anymore, the woman admitted honestly. Leonard slowly began his story. It was difficult to speak. He told her that a few months ago he'd accidentally learnt from Scott's mate, with whom they'd been drinking together, that his brother had been stealing from his old job, so the mate didn't know. He reported the fact of the endless embezzlement. It was Leonard himself who guessed from the totality of the facts that it was his brother's doing. The cattle were lucky then. When they discovered that a huge sum of money was missing, they gradually suspected another employee, but they couldn't prove anything. They fired him quietly. But the chief then stomped his feet, tearing in metal, promised that if there was evidence would tear his legs out, and wrote a statement to the police, gave the case a go. He said that such people should be taught. In fact, that's what Leonard threatened his brother with. He said he'd report him and tell on him. It wasn't just speculation. By this time, there were some facts that proved Scott's guilt. His brother didn't suspect that the younger one knew anything and was sniffing around, so he wasn't too concerned about conspiracy. And why didn't you report him for the crime right away then, when you found out? The wife interrogated. Because he's my own brother. Because another conviction would have been fatal to him. Would have had to sit for a long time. Because it would break Mom's heart. Catherine understood. She herself did not know what she would have done in her husband's place. It is clear that you need to be a decent citizen to live according to conscience. But here was a serious moral dilemma. This is not just a stranger. This is an older brother. I understand, she muttered. So what's next? You threatened him, promised to denounce him if he didn't return the money, and Scott taught you a lesson for it. That's exactly what happened. Stupid. You should have told me everything. Where did you go? Alone, without backup? I'm a man. After all, you haven't forgotten. I have to bear responsibility to be able to take responsibility. Admittedly, these words, spoken with simplicity and without pathos, caused the woman great admiration. It was something new in the spouse's repertoire. And what in the end? Catherine interjected after a brief pause. What did you tell the policeman? Nothing. How? Said the wife indignantly. Are you out of your mind? Do you want to keep covering for your brother? Good heavens, Catherine. Of course not. The man smiled slyly, as if he was up to something. I said I didn't remember anything. That my head was still foggy from the injury and surgery. They seemed to believe me. Wait, what do you mean? I don't understand. Leonard, however, only smiled enigmatically in response. You'll find out soon enough. Wait, take your time. The next few hours were troublesome. I had to go to the shop, buy my husband everything he needed, feed him. Honestly, Catherine relied completely on her husband and thought of nothing but the immediate and utilitarian. About an hour and a half later, Mrs. Sharon burst into the room like a whirlwind. Her first question to her son, who looked terrible and badly hurt, was, I hope you haven't denounced your brother, you traitor? It became quite evident that the mother did not care about her youngest son's condition. She didn't care about him. All she cared about was keeping Scott out of harm's way. Such open defiance, and the way her mother-in-law didn't hide it, didn't even try, shocked even Catherine. But not Leonard. He spoke sternly and firmly. Not yet. But the further development of events depends only on you. The spouse had never seen Leonard speak to his mother like that before. There seemed to be a change in the man, a break in him. Though should she have been surprised, given the events of the last few days, even angelic patience had its limits. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Sharon asked in a sharp tone. She was still apparently living in the past. Thought the younger son would give up. Couldn't stand the disapproval of his mother and older brother for long. He'd give in and break down. But he wouldn't. Leonard made his demands in a stony tone. Not a single muscle on his face quivered. "You're still asking? All right, I'll spell it out for the uncomprehending. If you and my brother don't give me back the $200,000 I handed you in the next 2 nights, I'll tell you about both the theft that Scott committed and the beating. I'm guessing, probably from the look of me, that it's at least medium bodily harm. You want to carry packages to jail and go on visits." Obviously, the mother-in-law wasn't prepared for such a question. She had hoped to butter up her youngest son, to somehow trick him again. But that was no longer an option. Mrs. Sharon even blushed. Not from shame, of course, but from rage and anger. "You wouldn't do that, you wouldn't. Do you want to test it? Won't you regret it later? Enough of your antics. I'm not going to fall for your fairy tales anymore. After this loan situation, I've realized and rethought a lot of things. I have no more illusions. I'm not going to be fooled anymore. Is that understood?" Both women opened their mouths in surprise. Leonard had changed right before their eyes. Neither his wife nor his mother recognized him. How could such a thing be possible? Such a dramatic change in a matter of days. And if the wife was ready to jump with happiness, Mrs. Sharon was visibly dejected when she realized that her card was beaten, that there was nothing to do. "Sonny, how can it be? Don't ruin us," the mother squeezed out her tears. "Are you serious?" That only made the man even angrier. "I've said it all. You have 24 hours and the countdown has begun. There will be no money. I've outlined the consequences. Now, if you would be so kind as to go away. I can't and don't want to see you." Now, the mother and her favorite son had no options left. They had to comply. They had driven themselves into a dead end with their actions. A day later at lunch, Catherine met with her mother-in-law in the park. She handed her the money, also in cash. Scott called his brother and asked angrily, pretentiously, "So, are we done now?" Leonard had no intention of giving in to his brother as he had before. Their relationship had changed forever. "When my wife deposits the money, closes the loans, gets the papers, then we'll talk." The older brother tried to start resenting him, pushing his own way through, but Leonard wasn't going to listen. There was no respect for his brother's authority or love for him. By evening, Catherine came to the hospital to her husband with a package of documents. She was glowing with joy and smiling. "In 30 days, the account will be closed, and I'll need to get a statement. But I have a certificate in my hand that I have paid the full amount of the loan, with the interest already accrued." She felt it was necessary to cheer her husband up and praise him. "Look, to be honest, I didn't think it would work out. I repent and apologize for not believing in you. I was wrong. You're doing a great job. It's just too bad the price is so high. You've been seriously hurt." "Oh, come on," Leonard interrupted her. "You're still apologizing. I'm the one who should be apologizing to you. I'm the one who got us into this difficult situation and had a hard time finding a way out. It will be a lesson to me for the rest of my life. And as for my wounds, I paid for the experience, so to speak." Catherine was tormented by one question, but she didn't know how to approach it as gently as possible. She asked cautiously, "What's going to happen next? What are your plans? How will you communicate and keep in touch with your mother and brother?" Catherine was scared to death that her husband would forgive his relatives again, that this destructive communication would continue and spoil their lives, exhaust their nerves, drain the energy of both of them, and then it would be over. This marriage will end in divorce anyway, and all the efforts will go to waste. And the spouse just started working on himself, started to change. Leonard even changed his face when his wife asked him. "Communicate?" he asked in surprise and laughed. "I don't think they'll want to." The spouse continued to cheer. Catherine, on the other hand, understood nothing. She was just preparing to ask a clarifying question when she was interrupted. There was a knock on the door of the room, and then the familiar face of a police senior lieutenant appeared. "Good evening. We had an appointment," he said peacefully. "Lo, of course it's nothing. If my wife stays, I'm willing to testify. The situation has been cleared up, and I am now confident in my words." Catherine's eyes rounded at this statement, and she looked at Leonard with horror, but he only nodded his head, letting her know that everything was fine. Everything was as it was meant to be. For the next hour and a half, the woman sat on pins and needles, and from every word her husband said, she was more and more surprised. Catherine had never thought that this was his plan. Leonard calmly and clearly told everything as it really was, told the truth, how he met with his older brother, how he said that he knew that he had committed a theft and that he wanted to report it. In fact, that's why Scott had beaten him up. Naturally, not a word was said about money and credit. There was no mention of the fact that the victim did not testify in order to get the guilty party to repay the debt, which seemed fair. The policeman asked many clarifying questions and carefully recorded everything. Leonard gave all the details he knew. He answered fully and honestly. Catherine, meanwhile, could not find a place for herself. She was very worried. She generally supported her husband's decision. Scott was an immoral man and a criminal. He must be held responsible for what he had done. Mrs. Sharon didn't feel the least bit sorry for him either. More than anything else, Leonard's wife was worried about herself and her husband. What if this comes back on us? What if Scott or some of his cronies decide to take revenge? The main question was, is tiding any Wallace? Did Leonard think it through when he took this step? Did he have insurance? Confidence in their powers and the justice of the law are different things. They're being a little devious themselves right now when they cover up their stupidity and naivety. Also, things not quite legal, not punishable in this case, but questionable in terms of morality and truth. In general, Catherine was as if on pins and needles and waited impatiently for the policeman to leave. She needed to ask her husband questions in private. So the senior lieutenant left the room only after 2 hours of exhausting conversation, which seemed to her like an eternity. Left alone, Catherine immediately lashed out at her husband, still shocked by his action. "Leonard, are you sure we won't get hurt for this?" "For what?" As if the man didn't understand. "What are you talking about? The cattle have committed theft. And why, you heard it all yourself. I reckon you've no doubt about it. Did he beat me up?" "Yes, he committed a felony." "Answer, I don't get the point of the question." "Damn, you're laughing at me. I'm asking about the money. What happens if the police find out about the money?" The husband remained remarkably calm and looked more like a Buddhist monk from the outside. "Well, sweetheart, what are you talking about? What money? Don't you get it? I have driven my mother and brother into the same trap they were preparing for you and me. You and I don't know anything. What credit? What money? What are we talking about?" And Catherine seemed to be starting to get it. "Wow, Leonard. Now it makes sense. I'm glad I managed to surprise you in a good way." "You certainly have." Now the man continued, "Won't you confirm my words if it comes to that? There's no denying it. Yes, I took out a business loan from the bank recently. But then we did another careful calculation and decided that it was unprofitable and the risks were too high. And the loan is too high because of the interest rate. If anything, it would put us in debt. Plus, I've had an accident. There's no telling how long it'll take to recover, so we took that whole set of facts as a sign, right? And so I put the money back in today. That's the explanation. Am I confusing things? Isn't that what happened?" Leonard laughed contentedly. Catherine laughed with her husband. Frankly, she was delighted and amazed at him. Such a marvelous calculation. And who was this new man? She didn't recognize him at all as the husband she had known for almost 10 years. "That's exactly how it was, my dear." Of course it was like that. The attacks were not frightening at all. Her husband's new quality, his cunning. She understood it was nothing more than an act of necessary defense. Leonard was finally becoming a man. He was defending himself, his sense of self, his beloved woman. Their joint interests and rights. To hell with that. And Catherine was proud of him. Such tremendous growth. It's true what they say, spiritual and moral maturation begins with pain. He'd been forced, pushed to the wall, coerced. And now her husband has changed. And he has changed. And still Catherine was tormented by a bad feeling. It seemed like they wouldn't just get away with it. And how else Mrs. Sharon would react to her youngest son's testimony? What would that woman do? You could expect anything from her. Indeed, at lunchtime the next day, the mother-in-law burst into the room. How she screamed. Until then she had been an intelligent woman, well-mannered, haughty. Now she was not shy and shouted, using foul language, cursing everyone and everything. Leonard and his wife, of course, were the ones who got hit the hardest. You bitch. A snake that slandered her husband. It's horrible, unthinkable. You got the money back. How can this be? Leonard, you gave me your word. How could you do such a cruel thing to your own brother? Catherine was almost inseparable from her husband in the ward, so she was able to observe the action. But she did not want to interfere. It was necessary to finally hand over the reins to her husband. Let him handle it. It's his battle. Leonard was surprisingly calm. Before, his mother's tantrums would have driven him to a frenzy, but now it was as if he didn't care. I don't understand the claim, Mom. What money are we talking about anyway? Well, what about it? Mrs. Sharon began, falling back on her own words to her daughter-in-law. Son, did you take out a loan a few days ago? There was nothing of the sort. Mom, are you confused about something? It must be senile dementia. Bastard, shouted the infuriated woman. What a bastard you are. Mom, I don't understand. I finally recovered from the injuries I sustained, from the heavy surgery, the anesthesia, the tremendous nervous shock, and I've remembered the events of the fateful day. The picture is very clear now. Yes, I had told the police that Scott had beaten me up. Why should I keep quiet? He did it, and we all know it. Where am I sinning against the truth? Tell me, or did he not commit the theft? Mrs. Sharon gulped helplessly with her mouth, gasping at such insolence. Her son's calm and neutral tone must have been killing her. He'd never allowed himself such insolence before. How dare you, Cattle, your own brother? How could you do this to me, to him? Catherine's mother-in-law was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, but those present did not feel sorry for her. Let them pity her where there is love, and they would respond in proportion to her attitude. What are you, Mama? Leonard shrugged his shoulders dismissively. What have you done? What's wrong with it? I merely returned kindness for kindness and no more. It's not all for you to pick the fruits of my foolishness. Trust sometimes has to be paid for. But a few days later, Catherine recounted the events to her mother with admiration and pride. She recorded in paint all the dialogue and the grimaces of the disputants. Mrs. Cassandra was greatly impressed by what she heard. I just can't believe your mum. I wouldn't have been there. I myself would never have believed Leonard talking to his mum like that. He used to tiptoe around her and blow dust off her, and now it's over. The hegemony has played itself out. Oh, God forbid that this situation should teach him some sense. I'd like to believe in the best after all. That's a different man now, the daughter enthused. Without losing my mind, I don't recognize Leonard. My husband is a man at last. Mrs. Cassandra hummed. Yes, indeed, sometimes the separation from your mother is too late and too painful. Perhaps, Mum, you're right, but it happened albeit late, albeit so difficult. What matters is the outcome. Don't you agree? It's hard to argue. Tell me, what happened next? That old woman never showed up again. She slammed the door and that was it. No, she called 2 or 3 times in the last 3 days, screamed again, freaked out, pressured and demanded that Leonard take back his statement, to confess that he had wronged his brother. And did he send her? Of course he did. Why on earth would he? Ridiculous. But now the tactics have changed. Mrs. Sharon's been acting like a loving mother, being sweet, silky, pitying. Scott's got a son and a wife, and she's sick herself. Didn't Scott think of that when he committed the crime? Mrs. Cassandra countered. And he left his son from his last marriage. He doesn't help. He doesn't keep in touch. And then what's that got to do with the child? Leonard asked something similar. So he didn't give in to the old furies, entreaties, and tears. I don't think any of this is going to work anymore. It's past the point. He's been dragged through the mud so many times, put down for nothing. That he's been taken advantage of so many times that he's at the end of his rope. I watched him closely. He didn't even move in response to Mrs. Sharon's tears. His decision didn't waver in the slightest. In fact, to be honest, I asked him to let them go in peace. Let them live. Let them get on with it, as long as it doesn't affect us. But Leonard gave me a stern look and said, "No, no way. Don't you have to teach them? I've put up with it for too long and let it all go," Catherine shared with her mom. And what can I say? Fair enough. Worthy of respect. Honestly, I never thought I'd use the word respect for your husband. But this work on himself, this growth, he's just admirable. Yeah, my daughter piped up. I still don't believe it myself. I'm afraid it's a dream. So I'll wake up and everything will be like it was before. No, it won't be like before. I guarantee it. This confusion lasted for 6 months, and all this time, the nerves of the spouses were frayed. The inquest, the courts, it took a long time. Mrs. Sharon and her eldest son did everything they could to get through to Leonard, to get him to change his testimony, to soften. In all sorts of ways, they wanted to make him change his mind. I don't understand. Catherine puzzled. Why would they do that? It's ridiculous. Everything's already been recorded, other evidence gathered. There's no way to get away with even a charge of injuring you. You can't even get away with theft. There's tons of evidence and another victim who's determined to fight. Why break through to us then? I don't know, but I'm guessing to break me down again, to force me back into the family fold, to force me to help, to ride me in you. Amazing people. They think they can get away with anything, no matter how many naughty things they do. Sure, they'll be reprimanded and forgiven. Unbelievable. The spouse only shrugged in response. He tried to minimize communication on the subject, and not because he was hurt. No, he simply made a decision and cut his mother and brother out of his life. There was no turning back. As for Scott's future, it was serious. Indeed, the very supervisor who had suffered the theft had shown up. He had written a statement, as promised, and demanded the punishment he deserved, refused to make concessions. He was understandable. He had a snake on his chest. Moreover, because of the swindler almost suffered an innocent man. How could such a thing go unpunished? The policeman at the next interrogation of the victim, just before the case was sent to the prosecutor's office, and then to the court, asked Leonard, "The accused is your brother. Will you ask the investigation in the court for leniency? Make attempts at reconciliation? It won't help. Cattle will still be prosecuted, but it could have a significant impact on the sentence." Leonard didn't hesitate for a second. Laconically and simply, looking straight into his eyes, he replied, "No, I won't. I am in favor of a just punishment. The cattle must answer for everything in full accordance with the law." That was the end of the matter. No matter how much Mrs. Sharon cried at the trial, no matter how much she begged for leniency, no matter how much she tried to pacify those present, it did not help. On the aggregate of the crimes committed, the court, taking into account the personality of the defendant and his characteristics, sentenced Scott to 8 years imprisonment. The mother sobbed and cursed the younger son. Did it offend Leonard? It did. He was ready for it. The man walked out of the courtroom satisfied, even though he was cursed. It didn't bother him anymore, as he later explained to his wife. "They are strangers to me already. Do you understand? I don't care about their opinion and judgment, whatever it is. I'm happy it's finally over," Catherine admitted. "I was afraid our marriage would break down and not last." Things changed. Things were finally starting to get better for the couple. It took going through these trials to find each other anew, to get things back on track. Now there was no doubt about the couple's social roles either. Leonard had learnt to take responsibility, to be a man in the full sense of the word. Catherine literally could not be pleased and thanked fate that all this happened. After all, as it turned out, all for the best, and do not believe after that in God and His providence. Very soon Catherine and Leonard will become parents. Now the future mother has no doubt that her husband will be a worthy father, that she and the baby will be behind him as behind a stone wall. It's a bit of a pity that their son will never meet his relatives from his father's side, although with such relatives and enemies do not need. So probably everything is for the best here too. The morning was coming on fast, as it happens only in summer when the sun begins to please the earth very early. Julia, as always, got up before her husband Dustin. She had long been accustomed to mornings, beginning with the quiet bustle of the kitchen, the smell of freshly brewed coffee, and the peaceful rustle of the newspapers her husband usually read at breakfast. "Good morning, Julia. I expect everything from you. But who needs it? I wish you were still in bed," said Dustin, entering the kitchen. She had just put a pan of pancakes on the stove. "Morning," Julia said, turning to him and adding, "I'm making pancakes for breakfast." Dustin shook his head, grimaced, and sat down still at the table with the newspaper open. As Julia deftly flipped the pancakes, she realized that this morning was not going to be as peaceful as it seemed. "Listen, Julia, you probably already know what needs to be done today, don't you?" husband asked, putting the newspaper aside and looking at her with interest. Julia sighed sadly. To be honest, his daily tasks were getting tiresome. One thing at a time. She wasn't his maid. She was not his maid, and she had a job to do. "I don't know," Julia replied sincerely, adding a dollop of cherry jam to the saucer. He grinned. "Well, since you don't know, I'll tell you. You need to go to the cemetery to see my mother. It was in the will, wasn't it? She wanted you to be the one to take care of her grave." Julia shuddered. Laura had hated her from the first day she'd met her, and in 5 years of married life she'd managed to make Julia recognize her unpleasant side. "Why me, Dustin? You know we've always been at odds." "I offered to leave her," Julia asked sadly. Dustin's eyebrows rose indignantly. "What's wrong with that? It was her last will and testament, so please accept it and show respect for the deceased." He raised his voice. Julia realized at once that a scandal could not be avoided. Dustin hadn't been himself lately, nervous, angry, as if Julia were to blame for his problems at work. It was a shame, she thought. She worked as a nurse in therapy, serving the homeless. No, Julia wasn't complaining. It was just that sometimes her husband's nagging became unbearable. The coffee was not strong and hot enough, her favorite cufflinks were lost somewhere, and her tie looked as if it had been chewed by a camel. It was all Rose's fault. But what else could it be? There's no one else. Dustin, not knowing how to continue the unpleasant conversation, reached for his cup. Julia, flipping the pancakes diligently, was already mentally imagining how she would spend her time in the city cemetery today. And this heat. It was already 35 in the morning. What's it going to be by noon? 40. Well, are you coming or not? You realize there's a reason for all this. Your mother named you in her will, so she wanted you to look after her. Well, so to speak, in the next world. And if I don't, I can't inherit. You know that. I need the money now, Dustin persisted. Julia removed another pancake with a spatula and turned her head to her husband and asked, "Do you know that I didn't like her very much when she was alive either? About the dead do not speak badly, but the grief with her I had a lot. So what of it? You think that matters to me now? My mother's gone, and I can't inherit because you're too lazy to go to the cemetery," Dustin said wryly. Julia's cheeks flushed. "I don't mind. It's just that I'm there every week. But why would I do that? You're the son, after all. I know you two have had a complicated relationship, but that still doesn't absolve you of your obligations," the husband replied, careful less coffee in the spoon. "Complicated?" Julia asked with pain in her voice. "That's an understatement. She disliked me from day one. She put me in her will as if she'd put me in a cage. I couldn't do anything without her permission. I couldn't even go to the store without her approval of my clothing choices. Oh, come on, it's your little business. You say you have to do it, you have to do it. It's a no-brainer. After all, it's not that hard. I'm in the office 24 hours a day, and I'm trying to keep my business afloat. What about you? Come in, wipe the floors, take out a couple of bottles and sit back and do crossword puzzles," Dustin objected. Tears glistened in Julia's eyes. How dare he say that, Julia thought. She remembered well how her mother-in-law had wanted to make her to her own standards, to make Julia like her. Greedy, bossy, cynical, the kind of business shark who had inherited from her husband, who had been killed in a crime spree. In the end, Julia agreed, she had always been inferior to her husband in everything. Dustin was a master suppressing the will of others, doing it every chance he got. Thus the breakfast, which began with an uncomfortable conversation, turned into one big insult for Julia. Her mother-in-law would not give her peace even in the other world, as if in mockery, having forced her daughter-in-law to visit her in the cemetery by means of a will. Dustin was triumphant. He felt victorious. The wretched nurse had gotten herself in trouble. He'd teach her a lesson. Julia decided not to waste any time, so she started packing right after breakfast. After all, she'd have to take the bus. Dustin was busy again, important negotiations, the deal of the century. Though he always says so, and then complains about the losses, or missed an important clause in the contract. The late Laura never let that happen. When concluding a contract, she always put on glasses and scrutinized every aspect of the upcoming deal. She didn't trust anyone, kept her managers under strict control, made them watch each other, collected dirt on everyone. A kind of gray cardinal in a skirt. Julia shook her head sadly. She left the house and went to the nearest flower shop to buy flowers. She didn't buy artificial flowers. A lib bouquet was preferable. The sun baked mercilessly. Even the asphalt seemed to breathe heat. Julia, roses clutched in her hand, walked along the hot path leading to the cemetery gates. She didn't like coming here. She'd always been uncomfortable among the gray tombstones and mounds of graves, which smelled of longing and hopelessness. But today she had to come. It was the anniversary of Laura's passing. The bus dropped her off at a stop about 300 meters from the cemetery. It was hot in the cabin, too. Summer was coming into its own. The temperature had risen to prohibitive heights. It was hard. It seemed like a short walk to the cemetery, but try to walk that distance under the scorching sun. Julia stopped to catch her breath. Leaning against the tree, she felt its rough bark on her shoulders. And why? She'd only listened to Dustin and dragged herself to the cemetery today. She'd gone along with his whims again. And she said no more than once. And she's still showing weakness. Suddenly, Julia felt sick. She felt dizzy. Her eyes went black. She tried to lean on a tree trunk, but her legs gave out. Julia slowly settled to the ground, feeling the heat coursing through her body. That's it. Here we go. Her mind raced through her head. Everything was double in her eyes. She was very thirsty. There was no more strength to get up. Everything happened so fast that Julia didn't have time to realize anything. She fell, and that was it. Unable to get up, she closed her eyes doomily when she heard someone's quiet voice. "Girl, are you ill?" It had cost her a great deal of labor to open her eyelids. And at the same moment she saw in front of her a young, slender guy, blonde-haired with blue eyes, who looked at her with genuine concern. "What's the matter? You seem to have fainted in the middle of nowhere," the stranger, dressed in the characteristic uniform of a cemetery worker, said cautiously. "The sun, it's the sun," Julia whispered, trying to pull herself out of the sticky oblivion. The young gravedigger didn't think for long and quickly picked Julia up in his arms and carried her toward the gatehouse. The boy had already guessed that she had probably gotten sunstroke from walking toward the cemetery in the sunny weather. The elderly caretaker had oriented himself in time and immediately rushed to help. "What the hell happened? She looks young. No wonder it's so hot today. I can barely keep from fainting," the gravedigger smiled, and then gently carried Julia into the room. To her surprise, it was quite cool, thanks to the fact that there was a fan running. The curtains had been pulled back, which made the room feel pleasantly dim. And she felt better at once. It was no longer the blazing sun, which was clearly going to burn everything alive today. "Thank you so much. I don't know what I would have done if it hadn't been for you," Julia whispered with a smile. Fred lowered his eyes in embarrassment. Frankly speaking, he didn't see any merit in helping a girl in trouble. "Oh, really? You're welcome. Anyone would do that in my place," he said. "I don't know. I know you, boy. You're easygoing. You always help and come to the rescue with a smile," said the caretaker. But the older man's eyes showed that he respected his colleague from the cemetery and treated him like a son. Fred was even more embarrassed, and then looked at the caretaker with a smile. "Come on, Stephen. What's the big deal? Just doing my job the way I'm supposed to. Everything else is just petty stuff." Watching their conversation, Julia caught herself the thought that she was imbued with undisguised respect and sympathy for both of them, because there was something in their conversation which unwillingly set up a favorable mood. Soon Stephen helped her to wash her face and bring her to her senses. "Here, have some water from the well. My teeth are chapped." Fred ran down to the village himself and got some. "So drink it. It tastes wonderful," the caretaker said with a smile. Julia took a careful sip, and indeed the water was very good. Perhaps it was the thirst that had been plaguing her ever since she had fainted. Looking around, she realized that the bouquet she had bought had been lost. Intercepting her gaze, Fred immediately added, "I left the flowers outside. We have a container of water there so they won't wilt. When you come to your senses, can you take them to the right place?" Julia nodded. At that moment, her eyes shone with gratitude to this nice guy. It was as if a good wizard appeared out of nowhere and saved her in a difficult moment. And really, it should have been Dustin. After all, it was his mother who Julia had just come to see. What's there to say? It's all so clear. Julia cringed at the memory of her husband. Dustin could have gone with her and made time for her on such an important day. Instead, he'd gone to the negotiations as if nothing had happened, leaving his wife to fend for herself. Would think she had the day off today. Otherwise, he would have had to ask for time off from the manager, who was extremely stingy with such generosity. Not many tomatoes, Grandpa Stephen asked. Who are you going to see, honey? Who do you have here? Pardon me for asking. I'm not really a nosy man, but because of my job, I had to ask. Julia laughed a little and then came clean. Then I came here to see my mother-in-law, Laura. She left a while ago. I've been visiting her ever since. Stephen looked at her with undisguised respect. That's the right thing to do. And then everyone does what they do. Say, my mother-in-law is not my own. Let my husband take care of her. And you do humanely. For a long time, I have not met people like you. Julia smiled. At the same time, Fred was watching her every movement, every gesture. The young gravedigger's eyes were filled with joy that he had managed to save such a good girl. When Julia finally came to her senses, Stephen gave her tea, not plain tea, but green tea cooled to a pleasant temperature, which was kept in an old thermos. Now, don't be afraid, I pick my own herbs. So this tea contains all the most valuable from Mother Nature. I used to live in the village, and with my grandmother often went to the forest for herbs. So I can always tell the difference between St. John's wort and mother and stepmother. Julia talked with the caretaker and the gravedigger a little longer, and then went to the grave. Later at the door, Fred asked, Look, do you mind if I walk you out? I don't know if I'm going to be sick again. I'll avoid the burial grounds. I won't go with you, of course. It's just that I'll be calmer that way. Julia smiled and accepted the offer. Deep down, she liked this young man, who behaved with her like a real gentleman. After all, it had been a long time she herself had seen any real manly behavior, especially considering Dustin's behavior, who at first had been quite different, attentive, kind, caring. Now he was interested in nothing but money and his own gain. But it was foolish to expect anything different from Dustin, given that Laura had been raising him. The woman was not a bad woman, and in business she behaved competently and unceremoniously. Gradually, Julia began to feel better. She walked in silence. Left alone with Fred, she felt constrained. This was despite the fact that the young gravedigger did everything he could to make her feel comfortable. To some extent, Fred had succeeded in doing so. So he switched to you rather quickly in conversation, which definitely made for a more cordial conversation. Soon a familiar grave mound with a massive wooden cross, custom-made by a funeral service, appeared ahead. As Julia approached the grave, she lowered her head mournfully. Fred had stopped a few meters before the graves, so as not to disturb Julia from doing what she had come here to do. Fred had been working at the cemetery for a little over 3 months, and in that time he had seen a lot. Unlike the other employees, he had no tolerance for alcohol, and never participated in the drinking that somehow appeared in the cemetery during the wake of the deceased. Almost no one knew that Stephen had personally contributed to Fred being hired. Watching Julia tidy up the grave mound, Fred suddenly remembered an incident from a week ago. He had been painting the fence at one of the graves at the request of a relative living abroad. This had been a common practice for a long time, as not everyone was able to take care of the graves of relatives who were far away. That's when Fred saw an older woman whose face was partially hidden by a black-colored shawl tied around her head. There seemed to be nothing special in the fact that a relative of the deceased had come to the grave. As she passed Fred, the stranger looked at him with a look of contempt that made him uneasy. Why is she staring at me like that, as if I had done something bad to her? Thought Fred to himself, and went on with his work. Meanwhile, the stranger in the shawl approached Laura's grave and lowered her head mournfully. Then she approached the cross, and wiping the photograph with her handkerchief, touched her lips to it for a fraction of a second. Fred wrinkled his nose slightly. No, of course, he had seen this sort of thing many times before and thought it was normal. Still, something about this woman's behavior seemed strange to him. It didn't fit with the look of someone who was grieving for a departed relative. In his heart, Fred himself could not explain what he felt at that moment. Most likely, it all happened at the level of subconsciousness, or came from the heart. Few people knew that Fred's grandmother was a hereditary fortune teller and predicted the fate with amazing accuracy. Unfortunately, this gift was passed only through the female line. And that was the end of Fred. The guy himself was not very sad about it, because all this magical paraphernalia did not cause him anything but a condescending smile. Only the late grandmother Emily endowed him with a certain gift, which manifested itself only in exceptional cases. For example, once, while still in school, little Fred felt that it was not worth it to go with his friends to skate on the ice of the frozen river. There were severe frosts. His friends laughed at him, and Fred felt that Erica was in danger. "Fred, don't be such a baby, let's go. Are we going to play hockey or just go for a ride? My father went fishing yesterday. He said the ice is 30 to 40 centimeters, said Fred, his best friend Vincent. The 10-year-old Fred just shook his head and referred to tiredness and problems with his lessons. In fact, he felt there was no way he could go to the fort today. Even many years later, when Fred recalled that mysterious incident, he could not explain to himself what kept him from taking such a rash step. Many call it an inner voice, some call it intuition. But here Fred literally heard in his head the voice of his late grandmother, who asked him not to go to the river that day. Fred stayed home, despite the sarcastic taunts of his friends. An hour later, the boy learned that his friend Vincent fell into the ice hole and almost drowned, getting frostbite on his hands and feet. Fortunately, the boy was saved. About 2 months he was in the hospital with severe pneumonia. Fred forever remembered that incident, and since then always listened to his inner voice. And so it was this time, when he felt that the stranger who came to Laura's grave was clearly not who she said she was. For some inexplicable reason, he had an association in his mind, a wolf in sheep's clothing. The vision was so vivid and detailed that the young gravedigger became dizzy. Fred later explained that he had probably inhaled paint fumes and had some sort of hallucination. It happens sometimes, especially when working in hot weather in the open sun. Should I tell Julia about it? Or shouldn't I? He asked himself. Although Fred had not seen the mysterious woman in the black shawl again since then, he suddenly felt a keen desire to share what he had seen. Memories of the strange stranger kept coming back to his mind. Perhaps it was all a figment of his imagination. How many people come to the cemetery to visit their deceased relatives? There's no telling, but for some reason he remembered her, looking at him with such contempt, as if Fred owed her something. Standing at Laura's grave, Julia felt ambivalent feelings. On the one hand, she was sorry that her mother-in-law had passed away so soon. And on the other hand, the young nurse still did not understand why Laura had refused her services as a nurse when she was alone with a formidable illness. Not only that, but she laughed rudely at her daughter-in-law's work, saying that her destiny was to carry ducks and scrub floors. Julia dreamed of becoming a nurse, but never graduated from college because of family problems. For as long as she could remember, her father was a heavy drinker, and her mother was struggling to make ends meet, working several jobs at once. This eventually caused her premature death. Julia will always remember her mother's words the day before she left. When you get married, always think of me and the life I've lived. And don't be in a hurry to give your heart to the first man you meet. But think it over carefully, Grace whispered and closed her eyes. Unfortunately, despite her mother's admonition, Julia had made the mistake of marrying Dustin, who had first turned her head and then made her his housekeeper. But what surprised Julia most of all was that her deceased mother-in-law was not at all like a sickly woman. To the surprise of everyone she knew, Rose had taken ill and spent weeks in bed, complaining that she couldn't get up because of severe internal weakness. Julia even offered to bring a doctor from her department to the house, but Laura firmly refused. "No, I don't need your doctors. I'd rather go to a trusted specialist in private practice. I am, used to comfort and do not want to be treated on a general basis." Julia pressed her lips together resentfully. "You shouldn't say that, Laura. I want what's best for me." The mother-in-law only grinned. "I don't need your advice. You better take care of your husband and keep your eyes open. And something he goes to me in front of my eyes, not fed. I've never had such a thing. I used to take care of my late husband from head to toe. Clothes always ironed, shoes shined. And the fridge was bursting with food, to say the least." Julia's cheeks flushed with shame. "So I'm supposed to shine Dustin's shoes. I'm his wife, not his maid. And what can I do about the fact that he dines and lunches in restaurants? Forgive me, but I can't cook gourmet food. But I do know a lot of delicious, simple recipes. Dustin, on the other hand, is all about the delicacies." Laura looked at her sister-in-law with distaste. "Fool, you will live with You will immediately realize that the man must be firmly in hand, or you will go to another, and then you will cry. But it will be too late. Nothing can help. My mother-in-law's words are forever etched in my memory. Julia never offered to help her again. Of course, on the face of it, there was nothing special about it. Millions of women all over the world face similar situations and live on. All the more so because Julia was used to her male colleagues acting as commanders. So it was with Dustin, who immediately took the upper hand and began to behave as if he had done Julia a great favor by marrying her. As she visited Laura's grave for the 4th time in a row, the grave itself was in perfect condition. The earth had not yet settled, and there was not a blade of grass on the plot itself. Taking out a handkerchief, Julia decided to wipe the photograph once more and then touch her lips to it. She couldn't say she enjoyed it, but she wanted to pay her respects to a woman who, though she had not been a gift in life, still deserved to be treated normally. But she didn't have time to do it. She heard Fred's quiet voice behind her. "Julia, don't do this, please. I beg you very much." She turned around sharply. "Don't do it. Why?" The gravedigger shrugged his shoulders. "I don't know, Julia, but I feel there's clearly something wrong with this grave. Can you believe it? A woman in a black shawl came here recently. Anyway, she was acting really weird, you know." "No, I don't understand. What does that have to do with a woman? Was she an acquaintance or a relative of Laura's? I didn't really know my mother-in-law when she was alive, so I don't know all her acquaintances. And I don't think I should be surprised that a woman in a headscarf showed up here." Julia's remark seemed perfectly reasonable to Fred. He couldn't tell about his inner secret gift that his late grandmother had given him. It all sounded ridiculous to a normal person. After all, there really are no fortune tellers, prophets, or minds. But in spite of that, Fred still had in his mind the memory of that terrible incident on the river when he almost died, but at the last moment changed his mind and saved his life. After thinking for a moment, Fred said, "I'm sorry, Julia. I probably shouldn't have interfered. Believe me, I didn't do it on purpose." Julia smiled, but still did not kiss the photos of her mother-in-law. Something in Fred's words seemed strange and even in some way alarming. In general, the whole situation seemed ridiculous and absurd from the beginning. Why did Laura specify in her will that it was Julia who should take care of her grave? After all, when she was alive, she did not do it and considered her daughter-in-law at best a servant, which by means of a favorable marriage decided to get herself all the profits of her son. For many people remained a secret that shortly before Dustin's wedding mother-in-law insisted that he drew up a prenuptial agreement. "Son, take my word for it, it's for the best. They may not be puppies, but they're all puppies. They're just waiting for rich people to screw them over and leave them with nothing. I know them, I've seen them," Laura said. Dustin shrugged. Sometimes he marveled at his mother's foresight, who, like an experienced she-wolf, sensed danger and skillfully avoided the traps set by hunters. "Okay, Mom, no problem. I was thinking of doing something like that myself. I'm glad you're supportive. I mean, I don't know how life will turn out. What if I fall out of love with Julia?" Laura had her predatory smile on her lips. At that moment, she was sure it would be so. After standing at her mother-in-law's grave for a moment longer, Julia decided to go home. After all, she had honored her husband's request, no matter what. She could tell from the gravedigger's face that he wanted to tell her something, but was shy. "Something wrong, Fred?" The boy hesitated for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Can I walk you to the bus stop? To be honest, I'm a little nervous. As soon as I found out that you go to this grave, I immediately lost my peace. Mark my words, there's something wrong with it. But what is it?" "I don't know. Unfortunately, I didn't take part in that funeral. Your mother-in-law was buried by other people. We gravediggers here are divided into sectors and districts. Sometimes we don't see each other for a month. We only meet at the gatehouse," Fred explained. Julia smiled, but refused Fred's offer. "I'm sorry. No offense. I'd rather go myself sometime. You see, I'm married, and if my husband sees me with you, he's bound to make a scene. I wouldn't want that." The gravedigger nodded understandingly, as if he had not realized that Julia was married. Of course, at that moment neither Fred nor Julia had any idea that their meeting at the graveside had already been captured on a hidden video camera. The small, peephole-like device was cleverly hidden in the niche of a neighboring tomb, from where Laura's grave had a very good view. And the most curious thing was that the camera had been installed not by Dustin at all, but by a girl named Sarah, who had been his lover for several months now. It was this red-haired beauty who wanted to watch Julia humiliate herself and come to the grave of her unloved mother-in-law to pay her respects. I don't understand her at all, the Julia of yours. Has she no pride at all? Your mother treated her worse than a servant. If Laura had treated me like that, I'd never have come to her grave. Not only that, I wouldn't have shown up at the cemetery or attended the funeral, she said repeatedly. Dustin grinned, but people are different, and Julia is a servant by nature. You probably know that people are divided into wolves and sheep. Here's an edited version. So she's a sheep, and I'm a wolf who's used to taking what I think I need from life, Dustin stated. Sarah looked admiringly at her lover, who at that moment seemed to her the embodiment of masculinity and strength. In fact, Dustin was not, nor did he have a flashy appearance or inner charisma. He was short, with a small round belly and sweaty palms, which he always tried to wipe on his pants before shaking hands. Perhaps if he had graduated from a theater school, he would have gotten the roles of small scoundrels, capable of small or big meanness. But at first, when Sarah had suggested installing a hidden camera in the cemetery, he had been against it. At that moment, Dustin was only concerned with the inheritance of his late mother, who had made a rather tricky will, with many clauses based on unconditional compliance with the last will of the deceased. At the same time, Dustin could not be said to have loved his mother too much. Most likely, he simply respected her, but nothing more. He had never known his father, had only seen him in photographs. According to his mother, Bobby died in a car accident, which was 90% likely staged by his competitors. Since then, Laura had never been able to get together with anyone else and lived the life of a recluse, holding her late husband's business tightly in her hands. Laura spent a lot of effort and energy raising her son, whom she wanted to see as a strong and uncompromising businessman. Often to build up his will and character, she locked him in a dark closet for some misdemeanor and did not let him out until the boy asked for forgiveness. Dying this way, Laura hoped that her son would turn out something worthwhile. But in fact, all her thoughts and fantasies turned out to be simple illusions, which were not destined to come true. At school, Dustin was often offended, and to avoid it, the boy made friends with bullies, reinforcing the alliance with pocket money allocated to him by his mother. The businesswoman learned too late that her son had long ago become a cash cow for the local gang, who took him under their wing. However, there was nothing Laura could do about it. Dustin had grown up, stepped into adulthood, where the turbulent waters of big business awaited him. But no matter how much freedom Laura gave her son, he still sought her advice and was afraid to do business at his own risk. True, in his mother's opinion, he lacked an inner mental core, which, in fact, makes a man a man. And of course, she did not say it out loud, but she was well aware that by nature Dustin was weak and could not become a leader. But Laura herself had plenty of all these qualities. The main ones were meanness and cunning, which Laura had used against her enemies many times, and allies too. Kissing Dustin on the cheek, Sarah asked cautiously, "Listen, what was your mother's diagnosis? Why did she leave so quickly? You had money, didn't you? And the treatment could have been organized well." "What really happened to her?" Dustin shrugged. "I don't really know. Mother had always been secretive about it. Mitchell, the private doctor, was the only one who had a good handle on it. I tried to talk to him, but he was so quiet, I couldn't get a word out of him." Sarah sighed sympathetically, feeling nothing for a woman she hardly knew. Sarah was quite happy with her current position as a favorite of wealthy businessmen. After all, she was well aware that Dustin would soon inherit his late mother's estate and gain even more power and influence in the ranks of the business elite. And Sarah was also very confused by the presence of so many clauses in Laura's will. It seemed that before going into the next world, this cunning lady had carefully worked out her will, not forgetting to place the emphasis where it was necessary. Sarah didn't really have to worry about that. She was satisfied with the fact that Dustin gave expensive gifts, took her to restaurants and spent nights with her in an elite hotel, where the number of stars was simply exorbitant. But the camera installed in the cemetery was more of a whim to once again mock the unfortunate Julia, who was not even aware of the covert surveillance. Dustin was quite loyal to the whims of his mistress, because he had long ago fallen out of love with his wife and seriously considered divorce. Of course, in her will, Laura left Julia almost nothing, except the duties of going to the cemetery and cleaning the grave. The businessman himself considered his mother's wish as the last taunt she threw in the face of her former daughter-in-law. After all, he still remembered well how she despised Julia, calling the hospital a dump. Fortunately, Julia managed to get home without incident. She was now aware of the sun's harmful effects and tried to avoid being exposed to it. But there was something good in all this. At first, Julia didn't even realize what she liked about walking in the cemetery. But then she realized that thanks to visits to her late mother-in-law, she was able to meet a pleasant gravedigger, Fred, who saved her and helped her to come to her senses. But Fred himself, as they call it, fell for her at first sight. There was something about Julia that made the guy's heart flutter with delight at the mere thought of a future meeting. On the other hand, how would they meet if Julia didn't come to the cemetery anymore? There was a chance, though. As she was saying goodbye, she left Fred her phone number, and when he took from her hands a sheet of paper with clearly written numbers, it seemed to him that it burned his palm. I guess that's what happens when you receive something that is of special value to you. And Fred was well aware that he had no chance of furthering his relationship with Julia. What could they possibly have in common? He's a gravedigger working at the city cemetery. Hardly any woman dreams of union with such a man, especially when married. Back in Stephen's lodge, he poured himself a cup of tea and sat down in a chair with a sad look. The elderly caretaker immediately understood what the matter was, but did not pursue the subject, not wanting to make the boy uncomfortable. But who among us has not fallen in love at least once in his life? After all, love is such a beautiful feeling, which is subject to all without exception. Young or old, all ages are subject to love. When Julia left, Fred's mood had soured considerably. When would she come now, and would she come at all? What can he hope for? Why torture his heart and soul with meaningless dreams and fantasies? After all, everything is as clear as day. They were too different to be together. Stephen was silent for a moment, and then said, wanting to support his friend, "Hey, don't take it to heart. I understand you as well as anyone." Fred raised an eyebrow in surprise. Yes, I do, don't doubt it. I used to chase after Rose myself. She was supposed to marry someone else, a tall, handsome athlete. He was a swimmer, and I was stocky, but not tall enough. You know, height matters to women, too. But I didn't give up and fought for my happiness. I gave flowers, inexpensive gifts, of course. Where does a truck driver get a lot of money? Well, it was my care and attention that won Rose over. We got married the same year. We lived together honorably. 40 years. I went to work at the cemetery for her, too. Every day I come to her grave. I live in perfect condition. I planted my favorite flowers. You can't come all the way out here, can you? I water them twice a day, keep them clean. The old caretaker's story touched Fred's heart, the tenderest strings of all possible strings. For himself, he had long considered Stephen a friend, or even a father. After all, it was the caretaker who had saved him when he had contracted severe bronchitis while homeless and nearly given his soul to God, unable to buy medicine. Stephen found Fred at a bus stop when he was suffering from a high fever, teetering on the brink of life and death. "So, do you need any help? Come on, I don't live too far away. I'll help you, you bet I will." Fred struggled to lift his eyelids and looked with surprise at the older man, in whose eyes he saw a real desire to help. "I need some medicine. I don't have any money. I can't work. I tried to apply to the social fund, but there is a sin all ended. I'm left with only greenery. I'd like some antibiotics," Fred said with difficulty. Stephen didn't ask any more questions, but went straight to the pharmacy. He didn't ask how Fred had ended up on the street or why he didn't have a home. What was there to talk about now? Stephen looked sympathetically at his guest, realizing that the past could not be brought back, and that, let's start a new life. And I won't let you roam around anymore. I work in a cemetery, my friend. Well, you could use a strong hand there. So when you get better, come to my gatehouse. I'll give you a corner and give you a job. Can you take my word for it? You won't be left without a piece of bread." Fred looked at his savior with gratitude and mentally vowed to start a new life. Perhaps if it hadn't been for Stephen in Fred's life, he wouldn't have succeeded in this task and would probably have ended up in the city cemetery. Only not as an employee, but as a deceased, unknown homeless man. Upon entering the house, the first thing Julia did was head to the bathroom for a cool shower. After all, after that baking heat outside, it was cozy and calm at home. Tomorrow she had to work another shift in therapy, where she had to work to the limit because of the shortage of nursing staff. Julia rarely complained about fate, never argued with the head of the department, who valued her for her performance and reliability. Who else would agree to go out on his day off, and even in this heat? And only Julia, showing sympathy, made concessions. Many people mistakenly thought that Julia did it to get a promotion or some other benefits, but she was not at all good at sucking up. And if she did help in any way she could, she did so only out of sincerity. Dustin was gone by the time she got home. Most likely he made another important deal that was far more important to him than taking care of his mother's grave. Julia shook her head, then turned on the television just to get her mind off things. He had become her only friend to brighten her loneliness, while her husband was at work almost 24 hours a day. Frankly speaking, Julia didn't quite understand why he needed so much money. It was enough to live on. Well, not such, of course, that yachts and steamships, but still they do not starve and can afford a lot of things that in her childhood Julia had never even dreamed of. Of course, she realized that Dustin had grown up in a different family, accustomed to luxury and wealth. And given that he was raised by someone like Laura, it was foolish to assume that he would grow up different from his mother. Julia looked sadly at the black-framed photo of her mother-in-law, and then gloomed. Deep down, she was very hurt that they had never reconciled in her lifetime. At one point, she even began to blame herself for not repenting to her mother-in-law. Shortly before her passing that fateful day, she had been on shift when Dustin told her the sad news over the phone. Julia also wanted to help, to participate in the organization of the funeral. But her husband flatly refused to help, as if she were a stranger to him. As it happened, Julia did not take part in the funeral, and it was not because of the strained relationship between her and the late Laura. Julia rightly believed that you can't hold a grudge in your heart forever. After all, everything comes to an end, so why go into the next world holding a grudge against your loved ones? She never got an answer to this question. At the same moment, the young gravedigger Fred decided once again to go around the cemetery to see the scope of work for the coming day. In addition to digging graves, he had to maintain the cemetery's territory in proper condition, mowing the lawn, as well as occasionally trimming the trees growing around the perimeter and along the alley. And of course, he wasn't the only one doing it, and all the labor was evenly distributed among all the employees. Even Stephen did not sit idle and often took part in cleaning the surrounding areas. But for the grave of his late wife he took care of in his spare time. It so happened that many people themselves brought wreaths to the grave of Laura, who still did not give him peace. From a distance he saw a woman in a black shawl. She stood at the cross like a marble statue. The gravedigger's heart beat harder. Without wanting to, he quickened his step, and deciding to pass quickly, turned around to look at the face of the stranger. But as Fred approached the grave, the mysterious lady was ahead of him and was the first to meet his gaze. And what Fred saw made him uneasy. He felt dizzy, his eyes darkened, as if he had drunk a large dose of liquor in one sitting. No, that's just impossible. I'm imagining it. A hallucination caused by the heat, the gravedigger assured himself. He stood frozen in place. His astonishment was simple. The woman in the black shawl looked exactly like the deceased Laura. Fred was stunned, not knowing what to do next. Guessing what was going on with the gravedigger, the stranger grinned and remarked in a wryly husky voice, "Why are you frozen, my dear? You should go about your business. Stop staring at me. You've got your own amusement, haven't you?" Fred shuddered and, trying to chase away the intrusive visions, hurried toward the keeper's lodge. When Stephen saw Fred, pale as chalk, he became alarmed. "Fred, what do you like? Did something happen or did you overheat in the sun?" "Well, Sit down and cool off. Have some tea or you might faint heat stroke. You know, chance is a tricky thing. You never know when it's going to happen. Fred looked at Stephen with a frightened look, then said, I saw a live admirer at the very grave where Julia came today. Stephen shook his head doubtfully. I don't think so. I think you're mistaken. It's all nonsense. I hope you're not saying it's her twin sister. There's just no such thing. But Fred persisted. He urged the caretaker to call the police. The older man looked anxiously at the gravedigger. Fred, are you sure you haven't overheated in the sun? What am I going to tell them? That the employee saw a doppelganger of the deceased on the grave. It's funny, honestly. It doesn't matter what's funny. I could be charged with false summons, which, that's punishable. It's administrative, but it still doesn't take the responsibility off me. Fred looked wistfully at the caretaker, but he didn't retract his words. Moreover, he grabbed the receiver of the landline phone to call the police personally. That's when Stephen realized that something strange was going on. After all, in the morning, Fred had been perfectly normal, but now he resembled a madman who had seen a ghost and thought it was more alive than anyone else. Fred had to make a lot of effort to explain to the duty officer what had happened and why he needed help. Fortunately, he was lucky. The police showed up at the cemetery a few minutes later, as the patrol car was just in the area. After listening to the gravedigger's confused story, the police officers grinned and followed him to Laura's grave. By and large, the law enforcers didn't even know where to begin. But when the stranger in the black scarf saw the officers, she immediately ran away, arousing their serious suspicions. Of course, the aged woman could not run far and was detained at the same minute. At first, the policemen took her for a madwoman, but when they saw the striking resemblance to the portrait on the cross of the late Laura, everything fell into place. Frightened to look at the police, the woman doppelganger immediately laid out the whole truth as it is, and also said that she was ready to make a sincere confession in exchange for leniency in sentencing. What sentencing? What are you talking about, lady? We're not actually going to accuse you of anything, the lieutenant said, barely containing his excitement. But what the stranger said a little later shocked the police officers. In fact, the woman in the dark scarf turned out to be none other than an imaginary dead woman who had faked her own death to avoid possible punishment. All of this came to light a little later when Laura began to talk about her past. Many years ago after Bobby's death, she, as his maid, decided to pass herself off as the businessman's wife. At the time, Dustin was only a year old, and his mother had died in childbirth. Laura worked for the businessman for the 3rd month and secretly dreamed of becoming his wife, or at least his mistress. But when Laura learned that Bobby died as a result of a faked accident, she realized this is her chance. One can only guess how much effort Laura had to put into pulling off this clever scam. In fact, she herself came from the province, looking for happiness in the big city, dreaming of marrying a rich businessman. When fate gave her such a gift, she decided not to miss it under any circumstances. By taking someone else's surname, changing her status, Laura began to dispose of the late businessman's legacy at her own discretion. At the same time, the cunning swindler gave away little Dustin for her own son, who all this time did not even suspect that he was raised by a mother who was not his own. When Dustin was called in for questioning and shed light on the situation, the businessman almost fainted from shock. All this time he considered his mother a model of inner strength and worldly wisdom. And in fact, Laura turned out to be an ordinary criminal who decided to appropriate someone else's luxurious and rich life. Unfortunately, the case with the cemetery did not pass without a trace for Dustin. On the same day, police officers found a hidden camera installed on a neighboring grave. Soon the operatives quickly enough came to Sarah, who had to confess to her connection with Dustin. Naturally, no criminal punishment for her was out of the question, but Julia already looked at her husband with different eyes. She also realized that for several years she was humiliated and tried to teach her life criminal in the person of Laura. After a week after the arrest, Julia filed for divorce. At first, Dustin resisted, tried to fix the situation, but Julia had had enough. For too long, this family bullied her, trying to humiliate and self-assert themselves at the expense of others. Already after the divorce, having received the long-awaited freedom, Julia personally thanked Fred, who at the very beginning of their acquaintance warned about the mysterious woman in a black scarf who came to the grave of her mother-in-law. As it turned out, Laura played this performance was not accidental. Someone from Bobby's distant relatives got on her trail and decided to bring her out into the open. Then Laura made up a story about his imaginary illness, so that without consequences to go into the next world and finally erase all traces of himself. But lastly, the insidious woman wanted to once again mock her daughter-in-law, forcing her by will to come to her own grave. It was difficult to say how the situation would have developed further, if not for the premonitions of Fred, who was rewarded with this by his late grandmother. Julia appreciated his abilities and 6 months after meeting agreed to become his wife. Looking at the beautiful couple of Fred and Julia, Stephen involuntarily caught himself thinking that sometimes life still makes quite surprising turns.